Valentine's dance? I'm 10.
You kids are growing up so fast.
And you did say you were all grown up.
I'm supposed to want to grow up. But maybe I don't want to do it as fast as you guys.
The world has been a lot to deal with lately, and I know that I'm not the only person who's thinking that. I'm also not the only person that's resorting to nostalgia as a coping mechanism. I don't think it's healthy to ruminate too much on the past, but I do think that there is a lot to be gained by revisiting specific aspects of it. And for me, that's rewatching and analyzing the media that I grew up with the most recent example being the Rugrats sequel series, All Grown Up. And once I completed my rewatch, all I could really say was,
It wasn't bad. Much.
When I first decided to rewatch All Grown Up, it was purely for nostalgic reasons. I was craving something familiar, and I only remembered a few bits and pieces from the show. Tommy making a movie about sneezes, the spooky ghost of a pioneer child, Dill's imaginary friend that Chucky accidentally murders, and especially that weird Yu-Gi-Oh! Parody episode.
Say hello to my Atomic Mime card. Atomic Mime? Meet Cyberclaws!
And given my still present fondness for Rugrats, I expected All Grown Up to be enjoyable to at least some degree. But it wasn't. My expectations weren't even that high to begin with, and I was shockingly bothered. In fact, I was so bothered by it that I decided to make an hour-plus video explaining why I was so bothered. Completely normal response, I know. And the craziest part of it all is that the original idea that I had for this video would have made it much, much longer. Because once I had completed my rewatch of All Grown Up, I recalled the existence of another show, one that I never actually watched as a kid. A show that was also produced by Klasky Csupo and came out around the same time, with characters roughly around the same age, and seemed to share similar themes to All Grown Up. And even though I never watched this series, I knew just from its very vocal fanbase online that it was truly something else, perhaps even one of the best shows to ever air on Nickelodeon. And so, with those expectations in mind, I turned on the first episode and was immediately whisked away to a little town called Sheltered Shrubs. And oh my god. As soon as I first saw those end credits roll, I knew that I needed to talk about this show. It wasn't like All Grown Up. It wasn't riding the coattails of an already established series with characters that I already possessed a fondness for. It was its own thing entirely. But was it truly everything that people said it was going to be? Well, let's find out.
Meet Ginger.
Junior high is like a jungle. It's got predators. They're prey. A few unclassified species.
Trade dentures with you?
No way! These still have prune in them. And me, trying to survive without becoming extinct.
To the uninitiated, As Told by Ginger was a show that premiered in the year 2000, 1 year prior to the release of the All Grown Up Rugrats special. Just saying that for reference going forward. The show's creator, Emily Kapnick, who at the time was mostly known for being a writer on other Klasky Csupo series, had one goal in mind when it came to creating As Told by Ginger, and that was to capture both the angst and the awkwardness of being a kid at the beginning of adolescence, depicting it honestly by addressing the issues that young teens face on a daily basis. Emily is quoted in saying that the plan was to have Ginger clearly grappling with a lot of the milestone stuff that kids deal with, like the pressure to fit in, the pressure to look a certain way, shave her legs, etc. I know that that doesn't sound very spectacular or groundbreaking given how all of this seems like fairly common elements that you'd find in any sort of coming of age story, but Ginger manages to stand apart from the others, largely due to the fact that it's an animated series that, while definitely comedic,
That's the kind of behavior.
isn't afraid to pull its punches and being more truthful towards its audience. Another aspect of Ginger's appeal to take into consideration is that I don't think viewers were initially expecting this show to commit as hard as it did to a serialized plot, as that was definitely a rarer route to take for most kids' cartoons at the start of the early 2000s. It seems like such a no-brainer in retrospect when you consider the kind of story that As Told by Ginger aimed to be. And after watching it for the first time, especially with All Grown Up still so fresh in my mind, I couldn't help but think how unfortunate the timing was for both of these shows to air. It's no fault of anyone at Klasky Csupo really, it's just that they are pretty much the same show, except one has genuine heart to it while the other is all grown up.
The truth! It hurts! It hurts like nails!
As mentioned in my previous video, All Grown Up was more so born out of popular demand after the success of the All Grown Up special. It feels obvious that this wasn't a show that Klasky Csupo was really chomping at the bit to make, but the powers that be didn't give them much of a choice. And I believe that their lack of desire to make All Grown Up in the way that it turned out was partly due to the existence of Ginger. They were basically tasked with making the same kind of show twice, while simultaneously trying to ensure that the overlap of similarities in both characters and episode plots were minimal. So it's only natural that one of the two was going to be objectively inferior as a result. And unfortunately, the inferior show got the bigger spotlight. On the surface, All Grown Up was just simply more appealing to general viewers, myself included at the time. And because of this, Ginger unfortunately got the short end of the stick by not only getting its time slot constantly shuffled around, but it was subsequently pulled from the network prematurely, leaving 6 episodes of the final season completely unaired in the US. They aired in other places, but not here for some reason.
Stupid America.
But one of these 6 episodes was the 3-part series finale that only sold for a limited time on DVD and VHS, which means that if you didn't get the DVD, you'd never actually get to see the conclusion to the show. You were just f***ed. But even then, it only had the finale on it, along with 2 other completely irrelevant episodes from the first season, while there were 5 other episodes just left floating in the ether, which meant that you'd be missing valuable context to the events of the finale. Honestly, this was such a middle finger to fans of Ginger at the time, leaving so many unanswered questions for years. Nick later tried to make amends back in 2016, 10 years after the show had concluded, by airing 4 of the 6 episodes on Teen Nick's new The Splat Block. And while sure, turning in something late is better than turning in nothing at all, last I counted, 4 is still less than 6.
Math is power!
It wasn't until 2021 that every episode of As Told by Ginger was legally viewable in the US through Paramount Plus, giving people the chance to finally see the show in its entirety in an accessible and legal manner. I honestly think that I dodged a bullet not getting into the show before streaming was a thing. I mean, I'm already a Hunter x Hunter fan. I wouldn't have been able to handle another series that has no conclusion. But to step back from this whole issue regarding the full release of the series, I think it's also important to mention why I wasn't watching As Told by Ginger back in the day. I know that I'm late to the party on this, but I was barely 5 when As Told by Ginger began its run, which would mean that I wasn't even completely out of my Nick Jr. phase at that point. I was still hanging out with my main man Steve every morning. Even so, once I started approaching my own preteen years and would come across reruns of Ginger, I was just never compelled to watch anything past the intro, because I labeled it as a girl show, and I thought that the characters were ugly. Which, I mean...
Oh my god! What's wrong with your face?
Fair. I definitely don't agree with the girl show sentiment anymore, but I can see where I was coming from on that second one. And I know that I wasn't alone in this. A lot of people were turned off by the show due to the art style. While I can say that's a valid criticism for general viewers to have, I do think now that the art style for the show is actually genius, because puberty is disgusting. As Told by Ginger doesn't aim to be pretty or romanticize the experience of growing up in a way that isn't truthful. This rough around the edges art style is actually what makes Klasky Csupo cartoons so distinct from every other show on the network. Ginger does seem to stick out more than others, but this design philosophy is present in practically all of the other shows that Klasky Csupo has produced, with Ginger not even being the tip of the ugly iceberg. Some of you might remember this, but back in 2015, a former Klasky Csupo storyboard artist by the name of Eric Molinsky created a blog post entitled Rugrats All Growed Up for Real. In this post, he touches upon the topic of generational nostalgia, as well as the evolution of fan culture over the years, and how we are able to engage more deeply with these cornerstones of our childhood. But due to the invention of the internet and fan culture evolving in tandem, it's become incredibly easy to not only engage with fans of the same media as you, but to also create and share your own personal artwork of your favorite properties. As Molinsky goes on, he mentions and provides examples of fan art created by people who grew up with Rugrats, with the common link between them all being that these are artistic interpretations of what they, the artist, believe that the kids would look like all grown up. 4, 3, 2, 1. No, not like that. We already did that video. I mean as adults. Molinsky stated that he didn't believe that these interpretations of the characters that he once had to draw himself felt accurate, mostly due to the fact that they didn't look, well, ugly. It really bugs me. Not the quality of the artwork, but the interpretation. We referred to them as lumpy babies for a reason. If we ever drew the Rugrats as being too cute, our executive producer would scold us. We were supposed to emulate the style of Eastern European animators, many of whom were brought over. So in response, he created a more studio-accurate imagining of the Rugrats as adults. People, understandably, got a little heated about this, as this kind of response came off as a bit arrogant. Almost like he was telling these artists that their interpretations were incorrect. He soon came back and apologized, as that wasn't his intention at all. He was merely advocating for the more unglamorous style that he was accustomed to. And I do believe that he did not intend for his response to these artists to be read in such an inconsiderate way, as I can only imagine how strict the guidelines were to drawing these characters and how internalized that process must be. But while Malinsky's points may have initially come across as tone deaf, there was something else in this blog that caught my attention. Earlier on, Malinsky says the following: I worked as a storyboard artist for the animation studio Klasky Csupo from 1999 to 2002, drawing the Rugrats, the Wild Thornberrys, Rocket Power, and the woefully underrated gem As Told by Ginger. Seriously, why didn't you kids watch Ginger? It was a great show. And then a bit further down, he goes on to say, when I worked on All Growed Up, a made-for-TV movie where the Rugrats imagine themselves in junior high, I try to keep the awkwardness intact. But the studio spun it off into a series, which I thought was too sitcom-y. If you wanted to see what the Rugrats would be like in junior high, you should have been watching As Told by Ginger. Did I mention it was a great show?
Alright, I get it!
While he may not speak for the whole studio, it seems like it's safe to say that while it was technically more popular than Ginger at the time, All Grown Up was, in a lot of ways, the black sheep of Klasky Csupo. Even though it was bound to succeed based off the viewership numbers from the TV movie alone, a lot of what went into its production weren't aligned with the principles that were previously set forth by the studio. This is only a recent revelation that I've had myself through chasing my own artistic pursuits, but when you're a true creator, money only goes so far when it comes to your motivation. And as I established in my last video, All Grown Up was purely made as a result of the desire to make more money. There wasn't any desire to develop these characters further or to expand their world in new and interesting ways, and this resulted in a severe lack of passion that's made painfully clear when viewing. Whereas As Told by Ginger actually set out to tell a story, proudly wearing the hearts of its creators on its sleeve through allowing its characters to learn, grow, fail, and succeed in ways that almost anyone can relate to. It's no wonder that Malinsky was still vouching for it years after being off of the air. The more that you watch, the more that you begin to realize just how personal the series feels in relation to not just the team behind it, but to you, the viewer as well, making it all the more disappointing that it didn't receive the recognition that it deserved until after it concluded. But I think that's more than enough of an introduction. It's about time that we get into the real talking points of this video. So let's hop on the bus to Sheltered Shrubs and get ourselves acquainted, shall we?
Someone once told me the grass is much greener on the other side.
Recalling the intro to All Grown Up with its aggressive pop-punk beats and lyrics that say, heck you, mom and dad, listening to Ginger's theme song brings up much more contrasting feelings. Written and composed by Jared Faber along with series creator Emily Kapnick, I'm In Between has a much cozier vibe to it that I really enjoy. Not only that, but the lyrics do more than just sell the vibe of this show. They key us into the overarching theme of the entire series. Ginger is a character that we see being pulled in multiple life directions throughout the show, and the song reflects that beautifully through its usage of the old grass is always greener idiom. What's interesting though is that this song went through a bit of a metamorphosis until becoming its final and most iconic version. From what I understand, they began with a rendition by Melissa Disney, Ginger's voice actor.
Someone once told me the grass is much greener on the other side.
Hey guys.
So my first impression of the song is that Melissa was directed to sing this song as Ginger rather than herself. The way that she enunciates certain words as well as the pitch of her voice feel like the biggest indicator.
Till further notice, I'm in between.
And because of that, this is a pretty rough listen. I think that's kind of intentional, however, as Ginger does sing many times throughout the series, progressively getting better over time. It's just representative of who she is in episode 1, and supposedly that's the only episode that used it within the US, as it was replaced by the second version come episode 2, although international airings did apparently retain it for some time.
Someone told me the grass is much greener on the other side.
The second iteration of the theme song featured, oh wow, Cree Summer again, who, by the way, also plays an important character in this show. What's funny to me about Cree's version is that it is very reminiscent of All Grown Up With You, as it features heavier guitar riffs as well as other musical elements that make it feel a lot busier than it maybe should be. Despite being a definite improvement over the previous iteration, I do think that this still misses the mark in comparison to the final version. It fits in well with the show's soundtrack, I'll give it that, but because there is so much going on, it gives more corporate approved vibes.
Right now the show, it's more, yeah. And you could bring it to more of a, yeah.
From what I was able to gather, because Paramount Plus uses the final version across the entire show, Cree's version was used in the US airings for at least the first season, only to finally be replaced by the definitive version sung by renowned R&B and soul singer Macie Gray.
Someone once told me the grass is much greener on the other side.
Wait a minute, wasn't there something else that I've seen Macie Gray in? Oh shit, she was in Spider-Man! I can see why they settled on this one and made it the definitive theme song, because it is such an easy listen, as Macie's vocals truly bring out the poeticism of the lyrics. And I feel like it's a better match for not just the vibe of the show itself, but for Ginger's character too. Having Ginger singing the lyrics herself, while a neat idea in theory, doesn't work out so much in practice, as in a serialized show such as this, she won't be the same character from start to finish. This feels more like Ginger's guiding voice in a way, a constant presence that's meant to keep her on track, almost even maternal in a way. Funny enough, I think that my biggest gripe with this intro is the exact same gripe that I had with All Grown Up's intro, which is that the visuals just never update as the show goes on. Ginger may not have had a change in art direction, but characters just do not look the same by the time you reach the series finale, although it's very likely that they just were never given the budget for it.
It's the money, Ginger! Gone! All of it!
I feel like this problem mostly lies with Darren, as he does not look even remotely the same by the time we reach the high school episodes. But I would categorize this as more of a minor nitpick. My enjoyment of the show isn't that impacted, and it's impossible to say that they didn't care about nailing the sequence, given the fact that they made 3 separate renditions. They definitely cared, so I'll give Ginger a pass here. I'm just sad that I didn't get to see a high school version of the intro to properly close out the series.
Finally get invited to one of Courtney's parties, and now I'm going to have to show up with some crummy old present.
So to give you some early insight into where this video is heading, I'm much more focused on talking about the various themes that are present within As Told by Ginger, and how they are expressed through the story and characters. Once we all know how things start and who's who, it'll be easier for me to focus on the most important moments rather than, well, everything. And I know that that probably sounds insane given the length of this video, but trust me. So without further ado, let's get to where it all starts. The inciting incident for the story of As Told by Ginger involves Ginger receiving a surprise invitation to the birthday party of a girl named Courtney Grippling. This is a big deal, because Courtney is the most popular girl in school, while Ginger is not.
Being invited to a Grippling extravaganza is only the single coolest thing in the world!
Courtney is also the eldest daughter of the most affluent family in town, which is not the reality that Ginger herself lives in. Coming from a single-parent, lower-middle-class household, she's the complete opposite of Ginger, the girl who is viewed as having it all. And in a lot of ways, she kind of does. But her sudden interest in Ginger is what drives the plot forward for the majority of Season 1.
Ginger Foutley, that's right.
But she's a total wannabe.
Still, there's something about her.
Especially early on, Ginger's entire life is dominated by the rules established by Courtney and the other popular girls at her school. She wants to be accepted, to be viewed as normal, which is what most kids at that age want. And Courtney, while not thinking that Ginger or her way of life are normal, is dead set on getting to know her better, which makes for an interesting dynamic because Courtney is definitely less normal than Ginger in comparison.
Perfect, Courtney. Don't change a thing.
But as Ginger begins to navigate through this new friendship with Courtney, she comes to rely on her 2 best friends, Dodie and Macie, who help her through these challenges and offer advice on what to do, while also sometimes requiring Ginger's help with their own issues. She has another best friend that she often goes to, her next door neighbor Darren. Living so close to each other, she has the most history with him out of all of her friends, making Darren her usual person that she talks to when dealing with family drama. But when it comes to the social aspects of middle school, he's not the best source of advice.
Count on it. Okay, sounds good.
But if all of her friends don't seem to have the answers or support that she's seeking, Ginger will then turn to her mom, who usually has her hands full from either her job or dealing with Ginger's younger brother, Carl, who, by the way, seems to be the main character of his own story, as every single B-plot in this series is about whatever the hell he has going on. In a similar vein to Ed, Edd, and Eddy, Carl is all about schemes that will propel him and his best friend Hoodsey to fame and fortune. None of them ever really work out, even when they start to kind of go well. But his storylines always prove nonetheless entertaining and even quite complimentary to whatever is happening with his sister. Carl, while not necessarily popular, does carry a bit of a notorious reputation among not only his classmates, but also the school faculty at Lucky Elementary. Unlike his older sister, he already believes that he has the whole world figured out, but as we see him learn and grow from either his mistakes or the people around him setting him straight, we see him become more and more mature as the show progresses. For the most part, not a ton of time passes in this show. Ginger only goes from 7th to 9th grade. However, she experiences a lot of those milestones that Kapnick mentioned earlier during this seemingly brief period of time, but it only feels brief when you're old enough to reflect upon your own experiences at that age, because when you're going through it, you're going through it. It's not just Ginger though, it's her whole family that experiences significant life changes in the show, illustrating the point that while Ginger is the titular character of the show, her brother and mother are just as important. Ginger, Carl, Lois, and even Ginger's father for that matter, all go through their own personal journeys in this show, and it's through watching each of them grow as people that we learn that As Told by Ginger isn't just about the difficulties and intricacies of being a teenager, it's actually about the difficulties and intricacies of navigating through life, regardless of whatever stage you're at, which is why I think it's necessary to first discuss and analyze the supporting cast in this show before diving any deeper into the true journey of As Told by Ginger. And considering that she's our lead, let's take a look at Ginger's friends first.
Dodie Bishop.
I think that Dodie is the best character to start with here for two reasons. The first being that she and Ginger seem to have just a bit more history together in comparison to their friendship with Macie. The second reason is that I fucking hate her, and the sooner that I'm done thinking about her, the closer I'll be to true happiness in this world. This may come as a shock, but I think that I hate Dodie more than I hate Chucky. And I was pretty harsh towards him in my All Grown Up video, but my disdain towards Dodie is for completely different reasons. You see, Dodie sucks in an accurate way. Unlike what they did to Chucky, she's not a poorly written character. Far from it, actually. It's just that we all knew someone like this in our childhood, and in my experience, they made for the worst kind of friend. That's not to say, though, that she's awful all the time and doesn't genuinely care about Ginger. However, her thirst for popularity blinds her into making the worst decisions, willingly throwing people under the bus for completely self-serving reasons. And while yes, this does make for a character that can be unbearable and easy to hate, it's impossible to say that Dodie's presence does not have purpose, especially when it comes to Ginger learning the difference between right and wrong and expecting better from those that she cares about. To provide you an example, in the season 1 episode of Lice and Friends, Dodie gets chosen to be the new school announcement reader, replacing one of my favorite recurring side characters, Chet Zipper.
Whoa. Thank you.
Right out of the gate, Dodie spices up the announcements by incorporating unnecessary school gossip, to which some kids love, while others clearly don't. And for whatever reason, none of the school staff really seem to care about this. Recognizing that Dodie's already stepping over a line, Ginger confronts her about it, asking if that's a morally okay thing to do, which it isn't, by the way. Despite these concerns, Dodie shrugs off the claim, as she feels as though it's her duty to deliver the truth to everyone, continuing to add fuel to the fire, much to the mix of both pleasure and dismay that the student body is expressing. Things change, however, when a lice epidemic breaks out at the school.
Six-legged beauties.
Dodie goes out of her way to steal the list of confirmed student cases, in hopes that by outing these students, she will have her journalistic career propelled forward, when in actuality, she's purely looking at this through the lens of personal gain. This is the first instance of us getting to see the biggest difference between Ginger and Dodie's moral compasses, as they each separately discover that Courtney Grippling is on the list of confirmed lice cases. Ginger, being inherently considerate, is able to recognize that Courtney really wouldn't want people to know this, this. And let's be real, not blabbing about it to the entire school is just showing some basic human decency. Dodie, on the other hand, sees Courtney's name and her first immediate thought is to let the whole world know, since Courtney is the most popular girl in school and it makes for great news. But what Dodie is actually hoping for here is that by outing Courtney, she can potentially dethrone her as the most popular girl in school by sharing the full lice report during the school announcements. And as she starts reading the list over the intercom, which again, why are none of the staff intervening right now, Ginger sprints over and stops the broadcast right as she is about to announce Courtney's name. This of course leads to a big fight between the two, but they inevitably reconcile by the end of the episode, as Dodie eventually reflects upon her actions. And what I appreciate about this ending is that Ginger, who was right the entire time, doesn't mince words with Dodie even as she's apologizing.
See, I really am...
Sorry.
Yeah, I feel like...
Such a jerk.
Ginger cares about Dodie, but she also expects better from her best friend. But does Dodie learn her lesson and do better after this? Well, no. This is really only the tip of the iceberg in terms of Dodie's shittiness, as she continues to invent new ways of being terrible. But to circle back, this through line of Dodie's character being as bad as she is feels intentional and meant to illustrate a point. Like, it seems silly to say that the show would be better without her, given how relevant she is from start to finish. But I really do wish that she was capable of reflecting in some long-lasting way. I'll be talking about her again later, but for now, I've said all that you really need to know about who Dodie truly is.
I told Miranda how you can't shave your awful red hairy legs! Oh!
You traitor.
Macie, on the other hand, while still very gossip-hungry, contrasts quite a bit in comparison to Dodie. Not only is she more likable, but she honestly caught me a bit off guard. When you're first introduced to her, you can't help but think that she is the epitome of teen awkwardness. And you would be right to think that. It's admittedly hard to even listen to her talk as she suffers from constant nasal congestion. And compared to everyone else in this show, she definitely got slammed the hardest by the Klasky Chupo Ugly Bat. But much like Dodie's characteristics, this all feels intentional the more that you think about it. Because out of the main trio, she's a bit of a wild card in a lot of ways.
Wild card, bitches!
Sometimes she's unnecessarily fearful, while other times she's overly confident. You never really know what to expect from her, and it makes her all the more entertaining while equal parts endearing. But when it comes to her friendship with Ginger specifically, it just doesn't feel as well defined as it is with Dodie. Perhaps it's due to her more unassuming nature, but none of that's to say that Ginger does not care deeply for Macie and her well-being. The episode that solidified Macie as one of the best characters in the show was the season 1 episode Come Back Little Seal Girl. The school talent show is coming up, and the girls decide that they're going to do an interpretive dance piece set to the song of the Little Seal Girl, which I don't think I need to explain to you. It's a childhood classic that nobody is unfamiliar with in the slightest after all. But as they get closer to the big night, Ginger and Dodie start to get cold feet after they get a less than favorable reaction from Courtney and Miranda about their routine. It's a bit rude, sure, but also I can't really blame them, honestly. And to make things more complicated, Macie has fully embraced her Little Seal Girl Sona.
Go Seal Girl.
They do their best to convince Macie to ditch the routine for something less childish, but Macie actually lashes out at the both of them, saying that she doesn't care if this performance is cool or not because it actually carries emotional significance for her. So rather than joining them and finding a new routine, Macie decides to go it alone and pay homage to the Little Seal Girl in a solo performance. Now in this case, having experienced the cruelty of middle schoolers myself, I was on Ginger and Dodie's side for this exchange, and I honestly believed that this wasn't going to end well for Macie unless they bailed her out, which it seems like they are going to have to do once opening night arrives, abandoning their act altogether and volunteering as stagehands instead. But what actually happens is perhaps the greatest moment in all of As Told by Ginger. In the middle of her performance, Macie's boombox malfunctions, which Dodie and Ginger take as their cue to start pulling the curtain on her. However, Macie begins to sing the rest of the song herself, slowly getting more and more into the groove and turning the performance from completely pathetic to absolutely triumphant.
'Cause I'm a little seal girl living in the real world, and it's so hard to get by.
And it's because of this that she actually ends up winning the talent show. And while she's happy about the win, she reconciles with Ginger and Dodie after the fact. explaining that she too is at fault for not respecting her friends and their concerns, even if things did end up working out for her in the end. This episode establishes a very fundamental aspect of Macie as a character, which is that she not only values the relationships that she has, but also carries a ton of conviction towards the principles that she has established for herself. Even if she can be a bit misguided at times, she at least knows herself well enough to personally assess her own actions in a situation, which is something that Dodie proves to be completely incapable of unless Ginger calls her out. But while Dodie and Macie are two of Ginger's closest friends in the show, it's time to switch gears towards discussing two characters who may not be Ginger's best friends, but do hold a considerable amount of influence in her life.
It's the girl in the pink capri. It's Courtney. It's Courtney.
I'm not gonna lie to you, I think that Courtney might be my favorite character in the entire show. And I think that it has everything to do with how stupidly rich her family is. I mean, it's the same reason that I love the Bluths from Arrested Development so much.
I mean, it's one banana, Michael. What could it cost? $10?
As these kinds of characters are just so obscenely wealthy that they become caricatures more so than characters. And that's not even a negative, because there is purpose behind it. Naturally, by descending from the most affluent family in sheltered shrubs, Courtney ends up holding the most influence over the entire student body at Lucky Junior High.
It looks like I'll be scouting for a new BFF. I wonder who it'll be. I have so many friends to choose from.
There wouldn't be a show without Courtney, as her interest in getting to know Ginger better is the inciting incident of the entire plot. She represents the other side of the grass that Macie Gray is singing about in the theme song. She and Ginger have significantly different ways of life, and they both recognize this. But while Ginger initially didn't expect to ever interact with her in any meaningful way, Courtney is making a concerted effort to understanding Ginger. I would say that she attempts to connect with her. However, due to the nature of her upbringing and lack of real-world awareness, making meaningful connections is a rather foreign concept to her, as many of her friendships, especially with Miranda, are much more superficial and based around status. But that's why I believe that she takes such an active interest in Ginger to begin with. One of the best early examples that provides us with some clear insight into just what kind of person Courtney is can be seen in the second episode of the series, Carl and Maude. It's in this episode that she and Ginger have their first hangout. Courtney invites herself over for dinner at Ginger's house as a way to learn more about the way that she lives. And initially, you suspect that she's there to do something nefarious, especially considering that she is taking pictures of everything around the house, from Ginger's toy pony collection to the vacuum in the closet. She does share these pictures with Miranda at the end, who does have a quick laugh at Ginger's expense, but Courtney doesn't seem to be sharing these in a way to mock Ginger, even though Miranda certainly is.
How did I know about the ponies? How did I know?
She's genuinely intrigued by the way that Ginger's life differs from her own. Granted, she definitely isn't going about it in the most polite of ways. At least, not initially. As she says to Miranda prior to her visit that she wants to dress in accordance to how much better she is than Ginger. And this is a viewpoint that she maintains not just towards Ginger, but towards practically everyone she encounters over the whole series. But it doesn't take long for her to start encountering people who really don't care. But despite this negative trait of hers, as we get to know Courtney better, you start to see her humanity. She's certainly a snob and is unafraid to say some pretty out-of-pocket statements without batting an eye. But as Ginger spends more time with her, you start to see the mean girl facade crumble. By getting to know Courtney better and by becoming an actual friend to her, Ginger starts to realize that Courtney isn't the person that she thought she was, quickly being able to view her more as a human being and less so as someone to idolize. The more that she learns about Courtney, the more that Ginger's gratitude grows for the simpler things in her life, as Courtney's wealthy upbringing has both prevented her and made her completely unaware of some of the most defining childhood experiences, like having sleepovers with your friends or going away to summer camp. And Ginger's knowledge of these things only makes Courtney more and more interested in getting to know her better. And as time goes on, you start to see that Courtney really isn't that bad of a person. She's simply just a product of her environment. She grows a lot as a character, but not enough to get rid of her ego. That always remains.
But I am a snob! I am!
And I'm actually happy about that, because it makes for some of the best comedic moments in the series. There is, however, someone who understands Courtney and the world that she lives in much better, and it's time that we finally talk about her.
Who's the girl who loves to ski?
It's Courtney! It's Courtney!
Before completely diving into our Miranda discussion, I need to echo back to All Grown Up for a minute, as Cree Summer, who we all know is the voice of Susie Carmichael, is also the voice actor who portrays Miranda in As Told by Ginger. I made a big point in my previous video about how Cree's performance of Susie in All Grown Up was pretty underwhelming, despite her character having much more of a consistent presence than in Rugrats. And I chalked a lot of that up to the overall uninspired and safe nature of the show itself, not due to anything on Cree's part. But to shine a light on what really solidified that opinion for me, Cree's performance as Miranda completely outmatches her performance as Susie.
Oh, I just love fire drills, don't you, Miranda? It gives you a good chance to catch up on the gossip. Last fire drill, I found out
Were you speaking to me?
Miranda is the complete opposite of Susie, which might make you think, oh, so she's like Angelica. No. If Miranda and Angelica went to the same school together, Miranda wouldn't even give Angelica the validation of making direct eye contact. She is the living embodiment of practically every Mean Girl characteristic that you can possibly think of. And as a result, you can just hear through her performance that Cree is having the time of her life playing Miranda. To understand just what I'm talking about, this is the first interaction that we see between Ginger and Miranda in the show.
Ginger.
Hi, Miranda.
I see you're washing your hands. That's good. Very good.
I mean, that laugh alone tells you everything that you need to know. Aside from being an advocate for hand washing, she's a master of manipulation when it comes to both Ginger and Courtney. She knows that Ginger desires Courtney's approval and friendship, at least at the start of the series. And she knows Courtney well enough to know what makes her happy and what pisses her off. She views Ginger as lesser, but her intentions are more focused towards making Ginger feel that way as opposed to just telling her outright, because that's more fun. But when Courtney expresses her interest in becoming friends with Ginger, Miranda not only struggles to understand why, but you can tell that she feels incredibly threatened by this, resulting in her going to some extreme lengths throughout the series in an attempt to ruin Ginger's reputation. A perfect example of this kind of behavior from her happens in the season 1 episode, I Spy a Witch. Miranda and another popular girl, Macie, who isn't important enough to have a section, but hey, this is Macie, graffiti the statue of their school mascot. And not too long after, Miranda decides to frame Ginger for the crime after losing the lead role in their upcoming school play to her. And fittingly enough, while the play isn't called The Crucible, it is 100% The Crucible. And if you didn't read that in high school like I did, it's about a witch hunt. One of the few required readings I actually enjoyed, if I'm gonna be honest. I really like the part where John Proctor says, "Leave me my name."
Leave me my name!
Good shit. Now what Miranda did wasn't as bad as, say, Bart Simpson sawing off the head of Jebediah Springfield. She only yassified it up to look like a witch, but their principal treats it as a serious crime. And once Miranda goes to the school principal to accuse Ginger and plants evidence on her, it ultimately leads to Ginger getting booted out of the school play, allowing Miranda to snatch the lead role from her. The episode resolves with Ginger acquiring the evidence that proves her innocence, but it's done through very spooky methods that I can't quite get into just yet, as it's spoilers for a later section. Ginger ends up crashing the play, in character I might add, accusing Miranda of being a witch herself, forcing Miranda to actually stand trial, but within the context of the play. It makes for a very entertaining and memorable conclusion to an episode. Unfortunately though, once the show reaches its 3rd season, we really don't get to see much of Miranda anymore, as it seems like everyone has more important things to worry about now. I do wish that she had more of a presence in the latter chunk of the series, but I think it's only natural that she faded into the background a bit. So much of Miranda's character is defined by how much she likes to prey upon people's insecurities, but given the direction that the story takes later on, it would feel almost weird to have her be an active presence still. Admittedly, it wasn't even until she appeared in the final episode that I think I realized she was missing for so long. I'm going to be talking about Miranda more later, but it's going to be more in relation to Ginger's character arc, as her last hurrah at the beginning of season 3 is pivotal to the events of the story going forward. But we do have one more of Ginger's friends to talk about now, and this one is pretty important.
Since you got the tickets, I'll get the refreshments.
I'm a modern woman, Darren.
Can we get a large corn?
Now, how do we discuss Darren? Because it's admittedly hard to talk about Darren at the start of the series, knowing how his character evolves and how important he ends up becoming to Ginger later on. When we're first introduced to him, he doesn't leave that significant of an impression, except for, you know, the headgear.
Well, if it isn't my little brother Meadowhead. Greetings, Wilbert. Ooh, I told you never to call me that.
He lives next door to Ginger, and they're close enough as friends to where he can just casually climb up into her bedroom window unannounced, like it's no big deal. Very similar to that one kid from Clarissa Explains It All.
Hi, Sam.
If I had to say anything about Darren, is that he's very good at playing the role of a supportive guy friend to Ginger. He's not afraid to be honest with her, and is familiar enough with both the kids at school as well as her family that he can give some pretty informed advice if need be. But at the same time, he's very bad at accepting or even listening to Ginger when she's trying to do the same for him. His stubbornness is his own downfall, and it all stems from this lack of self-confidence that he's cultivated from living in his older brother Will's shadow, and he never really grows out of these traits, even when his confidence gets boosted significantly later on. These two sides of him are demonstrated in two early episodes, Dare I Darren and Piece of My Heart. In Dare I Darren, Miranda, being her normal manipulative self, makes a comment to Ginger about how she and Darren make a cute couple. And she does this to confuse Ginger on her actual feelings for Darren, as the two girls both share a crush on a guy named Ian Richton. But this comment gets stuck in Ginger's head, confusing her to the point where she can't even talk to Darren without getting flustered. But eventually, this culminates into a heart-to-heart that the two share about what they truly mean to each other. Ginger opens up about her feelings first, giving him a chance to think for a moment, but Darren comes to the conclusion that claiming to be just friends doesn't seem to properly encapsulate what they truly mean to one another.
To me, we're definitely more than just friends. We're like best friends. I don't know. You're like family to me, Ginger.
And regardless of whether he stands by this belief for the rest of the series, which he doesn't, this moment is one of Darren's best, as this is the kind of response that I think a true friend should give. You can tell that he values her friendship through this interaction, and the way in which he shrugs off this entire situation to put Ginger back at ease is incredibly endearing. Even if they do end up reevaluating their feelings for one another in season 3, I don't think it takes away too much from the message that this episode presents to its audience. In Piece of My Heart, however, Darren's insecurities come out in full swing, and not in an endearing way. Lucky Junior High is throwing a Sadie Hawkins dance. And Darren receives an invitation to go with Courtney, unaware of the fact that the invitation was actually meant for his older brother Will.
Ow! I am! I can't hear you! I am!
Oh!
I do think that this is a good episode all around, but Darren is just not at his best here. And that's because he's very quick to get defensive as soon as anyone tries to tell him the truth about the invitation.
You just didn't think that anyone would ask me. Good old Darren. Always the friend, never the date.
No, you're not letting me finish.
I'm sorry you can't be happy for me.
Just the way that he snaps at Ginger feels very uncharacteristic given everything that we've learned about him up until this point. And unfortunately, this is just the beginning of all the dumb behavior that Darren will go on to exhibit. It isn't until Will learns about the mix-up himself and tells Darren pretty much everything Ginger already said. Will isn't always present in the show, which is unfortunate because I think he's very funny.
I'll still need that jacket dry cleaned and back in my closet no later than 10 a.m.
But his influence over Darren definitely is. He's the reason why Darren has such a chip on his shoulder in the first place, as people are always expecting similar things out of him when they are clearly very different people. And this eventually manifests in a lot of negative ways for Darren going forward, as he begins to figure out his own identity along with Ginger. But don't worry, we're going to cover that later. For now, I think that just about wraps up everything that you need to know about Ginger's social circle going forward. Which means it's now time to take a look at the younger Foutley sibling and the major players in his life.
Behold, Wolf Boy!
So remember how in All Grown Up, Dill's entire shtick was that he was just weird?
Uh-oh.
But his weirdness was kinda Wonka-esque in the sense that you felt like he was just always doing a bit.
Guys gotta eat.
Well, Carl's brand of weirdness feels more Lynchian by comparison. And I'm not just saying that because at one point Carl has a dream sequence that is an unabashed homage to Twin Peaks. Although I do really like that scene. Carl is the type of weird where you don't really want to f with him because you're afraid that he might actually do something drastic in response. He's garnered a notorious reputation among both his peers and the adults present in his life, with nobody really trusting him due to their previous experiences. And you'd think that based on that description alone, he would lean more towards being a bully, but I don't think that's quite accurate. In truth, self-serving is a much better descriptor when it comes to Carl. He really couldn't be any more different from Ginger, as his goals and aspirations are far grander than simply fitting in with the rest of society. He actually goes out of his way to not fit in, embracing everything that's considered weird, gross, or off-putting, much to the dismay of his family.
Carl, for the 100th time, there were two things I've asked you not to discuss at the table. Revenge and displaced body parts. You just violated both.
What's fascinating to me about Carl, though, is that while the majority of his struggles are less conventional and relatable than Ginger's, he seems to be a vessel for the writers to get more complex and nuanced with the challenges and life lessons that they throw in his direction. He may not be as honest of a representation for his age group like his sister, however I do think that the relatability that he provides speaks to an important demographic nonetheless. Specifically, I'm talking about neurodivergency, as well as the kids who were forced to grow up more quickly than they probably should have. Many people have already given up on Carl at the start of the series, especially the staff at Lucky Elementary. Granted, he does have a penchant for causing mayhem, but I think a lot of that stems from him receiving a lack of respect. Because when someone older actually takes an interest in him that isn't under the guise of reprimand, you can see that he's shockingly cooperative and respectful. Sure, it can be easy to label Carl as nothing more than the comic relief of the show while Ginger learns what life at this age truly means, but in reality, the kinds of challenges that Carl faces transcend childhood and speak more to the experience of being human, and this is demonstrated to us beautifully in the second episode of the show, Carl and Maude. In this episode, Carl ends up befriending an elderly woman by the name of Maude at the senior center, as they both share a mutual enjoyment of pranking people.
Steady now! Whoops.
It's all one big homage to the 1971 comedy film Harold and Maude, which is about a young boy who is kinda weird. I'm just gonna leave it at that. Just like Carl, he meets an eccentric old woman named Maude and their friendship blossoms, and in turn, so do his feelings for her. The same thing happens to Carl here, and when he says that he's in love with her and plans on proposing, as crazy as that sounds, you can tell that he's fully aware of the significance of this gesture. And given that we've only just met Carl, it's quite hard to tell whether this is a sign of his maturity, given how made up his mind is, but also how immature he is, given that he's fallen in love with someone who is around 10 times his own age. But much like Harold's Maude, Carl's Maude suffers the same fate, only instead of it being a beautiful moment, it's more like...
Oh, fool!
Yeah. Episode 2 of the show, folks. We don't hear much from Carl after the fact, except for the reconciliation talk that he has with his best friend Hoodsey.
Pretty cool that she left you her gallstone. Only Maude.
But we do hear Ginger briefly talk about the funeral that was held for Maude, mentioning this.
Carl's eulogy was really touching. I think he may have even loved her.
To have the youngest character in the show experience such a significant loss so early on was a very bold move, but it's also one that felt ultimately necessary to further introduce viewers to the kind of show that Ginger was going to be. Carl was never intended to be the annoying and weird little brother character that he very well could have been. Instead, he gets the chance to deliver even grander and more nuanced messages to a demographic of kids that Ginger and her friends aren't fully capable of relating to themselves. And for that, I really appreciate him. We'll be talking more about Carl later, but it's also important to mention that he would be nothing without his best friend in the world, Hoodsey.
What? We can't go to summer school, Carl! I'll sweat up a storm! We'll have to wring out my jersey!
Hoodsey is practically an extension of Carl, as the two of them are rarely ever apart and he always goes along with whatever scheme Carl comes up with. Hoodsey is also the younger brother of Dodie, which is shocking because he is significantly more tolerable and arguably a much better person, despite the company that he chooses to keep. He's essentially Carl's moral compass in a lot of respects. Sure, he still goes along with most of Carl's schemes.
All vampire cleaning service.
We won't suck your blood, just your dust.
But we don't do windows or mirrors.
But Hoodsey does have a lot of strong principles that he not just holds himself to, but he holds Carl to them as well, snapping him back into reality before he ends ends up going too far down the path of delinquency, Carl both respects and depends on Hoodsey, making their partnership feel 50-50 more often than not. Even if Carl is the brains of the operation, he knows that he needs someone like Hoodsey by his side. Like many of the characters in this show, Hoodsey caught me off guard initially. When I saw him for the first time, I anticipated him to be a lot more spineless than he actually is. I won't say that he doesn't have insecurities, he's definitely got a lot of those, hence why the baggy hoodie that he wears all the time has become his very namesake. But he's comfortable enough around Carl to be himself, which honestly isn't even the case for his own family. And you know, while I'm on the subject, as I previously mentioned, he's Dodie's little brother, and they also interact with each other even less so than Ginger and Carl do. And just to give you an idea, I think that this is the most meaningful conversation that the two of them have with each other over the whole series.
Hoodsey, I have some terrible news. Nana Bishop died tonight.
Okay.
I know that might seem like a joke, but I'm actually serious. But this moment does come from what is perhaps my favorite Hoodsey-centric episode in the whole show, losing Nana Bishop from season 2. I've been trying to focus on earlier episodes for everyone else's breakdowns, but this one is just too good to not highlight for Hoodsey.
It's simply too good.
You already got the setup, so let me just tell you how this all goes down.
Well, the kids can barely contain their grief.
After the passing of their grandmother, Hoodsey is requested to deliver a eulogy at her funeral, and this brings up some complicated emotions for Hoodsey, as he feels his Nana never really liked him much to begin with, and because of that, he never really liked her. A lot of those feelings stem from how she treated him in comparison to Dodie, who seemed to be her favorite grandchild. Much like the more complex and personal storylines that Carl goes through, Hoodsey here gets thrown into a unique situation that most kids his age may never experience. Death is a weird subject for kids, mostly due to them not yet possessing the mental faculties used to even process its full significance. It's a multifaceted issue with emotional impacts that vary from person to person, so for both Carl and Hoodsey, the show's two youngest characters, to demonstrate these feelings, it simply elevates the show for me in ways that I don't have the proper words to describe. Not to dismiss Dodie's display of grief in this episode, but it's just a display rather than a journey. And Hoodsey's journey reaches its climax once it comes time for him to deliver the eulogy. He ends up going on a rant about the various ways in which Nana Bishop frustrated him.
Nana made me nervous, so I avoided her a lot. Oh my goodness. She didn't really know how to play boy games. When she and Dodie did girl stuff, I'd play with her denture cleaning tablets, which are really cool because they make all this blue foam. She used to make me eat rum raisin ice cream, too. But she let Dodie have chocolate.
But the more that he goes on, he slowly begins to recognize the reasoning behind her actions. And once he brushes past his own immaturity and way of thinking, he actually realizes that she did, in fact, love him, and that her impact on him was far greater than he even realized. It's a really beautiful monologue. In case you couldn't tell, Carl and Hoodsey resonate a lot with me. Their friendship feels more unique than many other best friend relationships that we've seen on Nickelodeon. They're always each other's ride or die, and even when conflict does come between them, they always end up reconciling in ways that feel even more mature than what their older sisters seem capable of. But that's not to say that there aren't people out there that truly bring out the worst in them.
We've come to take you away and see if dead people want you. So there.
Much like Ginger, Carl is also on the radar of one of the Grippling children, Courtney's younger brother Blake. Unlike the dynamic that their sisters share, the situation here is reversed, with Carl being the one who holds the most influence. Naturally, with Blake being a Grippling, he comes preloaded with that natural sense of entitlement, and Carl, of course, isn't the kind of person to just give this kid what he wants, making for an interesting rivalry between the two. What Blake truly wants at the end of the day is to just be Carl's friend. Maybe more, actually. He does have a few interesting lines that imply that he might actually just have a crush on him.
Carl!
Woody? Where's Carl? He'll want a hand at rescuing me.
He's into the same weird things as Carl, but most of the time they end up competing against one another rather than collaborating. And I think that a lot of this comes from the same issue that Courtney suffers from, which is that disconnect that they both experience when interacting with the pause.
Mama, what does slurp you're soup mean.
I'm not sure.
But unlike his sister, his social awkwardness is much more obvious. Unfortunately for Blake as well, Carl doesn't really want to have any other friends outside of Hoodsey, likely due to his issues with trusting others. It's a constant battle of the egos with these two, but their egos derive from two separate places entirely. Blake already has everything money can buy, and Carl has everything that money can't buy. But at the same time, Carl desperately wants to be rich, while Blake just wants to have a real friend, other than Winston, I guess.
Do I look cool enough to play with?
You're all that and a bag of fish and chips, sir.
It makes sense for them to naturally gravitate towards the other, but sadly, neither of them want to put aside their sense of pride and give in to what the other desires. While I have already talked about this episode, the B-plot in Dare I Darren perfectly showcases what Carl and Blake's dynamic is like. It also introduces a recurring plot thread for Carl and Blake that carries out through most of the series. After getting stuck with the task of delivering Blake's homework to him, Carl and Hoodsey see that a brand new telescope is sitting on his doorstep. Carl desperately wants to nab it for himself, but Hoodsey insists that he has to get Blake's permission to borrow it first. But the reason for Blake's absence that day was due to him having his tonsils removed, rendering him incapable of speech, which Carl sees as a golden opportunity, as Blake can't physically say no due to his throat needing to heal. This doesn't end up working out for him though, as Blake pushes through the pain and screams no at him.
No! 1,000,000 times no, I say! Absolutely not!
Carl is understandably very bitter after this, and as he and Hoodsey are heading back to the nurse's lounge to wait for Lois, they mistakenly enter the waste room instead. And it's here where they find Blake's freshly removed tonsils. So naturally, they steal the tonsils and show them off to Blake as they leave. And this seriously pisses off Blake, becoming a major motivating force for him, as he wants nothing more than to just get his tonsils back from Carl. It's so petty and gross, but at the same time, I feel like this is their dynamic in its truest form. They never really do end up becoming friends, but their understanding of one another deepens the more as time goes on. Blake brings a lot of interesting comedic subplots to the show and proves many times over to be an excellent foil to Carl.
What's that on your chin? A chin. Duh.
But it seems as though he was just destined to be the butt of the joke by the time things start wrapping up. There's one more character that I would like to talk about in relation to Carl, and her name is Noelle Sussman. Initially, Noelle started out as a background character in season 1, which is something that I don't think you really catch until your second watch through. What's funny about this though is that they make a joke about the fact that she was a background character by showing footage of her being an actual extra on a TV show. I know I've been praising the show for its relatability, but this just feels like a personal attack right now. Her official debut is in the episode, and she was gone. It's in this episode that Carl and Hoodsey acquire some vanishing powder from their local magic shop, and they plan to use it on somebody that is essentially a non-presence. They prefer to use the vanishing powder on Blake, but that would be too obvious, so they set their eyes on Noelle. But once they've already put their plan into action, Carl comes to the realization that she's just as weird as he is, making him not only regret his decision to make her vanish, but also that he might have feelings for her. She actually does end up vanishing, her desk empty the next day at school, and Carl completely spirals, going as far as selling his prized petrified eyeball to Blake in order to procure a supposed reversal potion from the magic shop. And once he pours the potion onto the floor of her desk, his teacher explains to him that she simply transferred schools, allowing them to reunite and for Carl to get a chance to get to know the only person that's truly as weird as him.
Think you what my voice would sound like if we were underwater? Ah, okay. Wow.
Oh, and I should also probably mention that she's voiced by Emily Kapnick herself, which honestly makes me feel like Noelle is her true self-insert character instead of Ginger. There's much more to Noelle that I could go over, but I think that will have to do for now, as one of her most defining qualities ties directly into the plot, so I'd like to save that for later. Anyway, those are pretty much the only kids that we see Carl interact with on a regular basis. So now I think we should move on to... Wait, what? Okay. There's one more, but this is all I'm gonna say about him, because he has no bearing on the overall plot and exists purely to annoy Carl, Hoodsey, and me.
And if they only knew what a teen show wants to do every time the
Brandon is a kid who has a monkey named Mr. Licorice. I like Mr. Licorice, but I hate Brandon. Brandon is so insufferable that even Mr. Licorice hates him. Nobody likes him, so why is he here? Sure, I don't like Dodie, but at least she serves some kind of purpose. Even if that purpose is to show you how to not be a piece of shit. The only purpose that Brandon seems to have is to irritate Carl and Hoodsey. Even more so than Blake, who, guess what, also hates Brandon. He's just relevant enough to get mentioned here, but he's thankfully just irrelevant enough to where he has no reason to get brought up again in this video. If you've watched As Told by Ginger before, then I'm going to assume that you agree with his lack of inclusion here. But if you haven't, and you're curious about where all of this is coming from, let me give you a little taste of what this dude is like. You're welcome. I think that it's safe to say that we have a pretty solid understanding of our main cast of young characters. But before we start getting into the full story and themes of As Told by Ginger, I'd like to talk about two more characters, Lois and Jonas Foutley.
Carl, what are you doing with car companion Bob? You know I don't like driving at night without him.
Lois is the primary caretaker of Ginger and Carl, as their father Jonas is, at least at the start of the series, completely out of the picture.
Congratulations on your graduation.
Yeah, graduation was only like last June.
On top of being a single mother, she's also a nurse at the local hospital, meaning when she's not taking care of her kids, she's taking care of other people. And as a result of this mix, she seems to be in a constant state of exasperation, only ever really snapping if Ginger directly disobeys her, which doesn't really happen too often, as the two of them have a pretty solid relationship. When it comes to Carl though, Lois usually tries her best to look the other way from anything that he might be doing, and that's for the sake of her own mental health. Within reason, of course. But despite her exhaustion, it's made very clear that she not only cares about her family deeply, but is trying her best given the circumstances.
So you're saying you don't find Carl charming? Because he said...
You poor dear woman.
They don't really have a lot of money. And that is a recurring stressor for Lois that gets explored more deeply over time. Her ex-husband Jonas has left most of, if not all of the parenting responsibilities to her, give or take paying child support, which I'm mostly sure he does. He gets brought up for the first time in the season 1 episode, Hello Stranger. It's in this episode that Ginger is set to recite a poem at her school's upcoming Fall Arts Festival. She not only invites her dad to attend, but the poem that she ends up writing is inspired by her yearning for him to be more present in her life. We're never given a definitive answer as to why Lois and Jonas ended things, but considering that he hasn't even been brought up until now, and nobody other than Ginger seems to think he'll show up, it must have been pretty rough.
Maybe this is a bad idea.
But while this episode is clearly Ginger focused, we are given a very enlightening perspective on just what kind of parent Lois is. As Ginger is preparing for the festival, Carl in the B-plot receives a dehydrated snake product in the mail, which, call me crazy, but I don't think any breed of snake works like sea monkeys. But whatever. He prepares the snake in their lemonade pitcher and leaves it in the fridge, excited about having a fully grown snake in the morning to take for school pet day. But after returning home late from work, Lois mistakes the snake product for actual lemonade and drinks it. And this ends up landing her in the hospital, with Carl eventually ending up in the hospital as well for monkey-related reasons. You don't have to worry about it. But this leaves none of Ginger's family available to attend the show, except for her dad. And sure enough, as Ginger takes the stage and recites her poem, she scans over the crowd, looking for her father's face. But he's nowhere in sight. Ginger's disappointment is obvious. But as people are congratulating her backstage, she receives flowers along with a message from her dad. But these flowers and this message weren't from Jonas. They were sent by Lois. As Lois knew that out of everyone in the family, Ginger was most hoping for him to be in attendance. The episode concludes with a phone call between Ginger and Lois, who is excitedly asking for all the details. And before Ginger even starts, she takes a moment to say this.
Thanks for the flowers.
And it's through those 4 words we are shown just how deep their bond is. Even if it was just as simple as Ginger recognizing that only her mom would know that she likes sunflowers. As Lois made a point of emphasizing this to the flower shop, we can tell that they share a strong love and appreciation for one another. There are plenty of examples throughout the show that demonstrate just how much they love each other, but this one, for me at least, hits the hardest.
He may be a little flaky, but he's your father, and he's not a bad guy. At some point, you kids are gonna have to decide what role he plays in your lives.
Jonas does eventually make an appearance by the end of season 1, which is entitled An Even Steven Holiday Special. The build up to his return comes from Hoodsey and Carl fighting over the existence of Santa Claus, as Hoodsey is a devout believer, but Carl, being as cynical as he is about everything, tries to talk sense into Hoodsey over the matter.
I can't sit here and listen to you disrespect Santa for one moment longer.
Desperate to make Carl a believer, Hoodsey approaches a Santa on the street that's soliciting donations from Christmas shoppers, and Hoodsey proceeds to explain to this Santa that the reason why Carl doesn't believe in him is that his Christmas wish has never been fulfilled, and that one wish for years has always been to receive a visit from his dad on Christmas. Unbeknownst to Hoodsey, this Santa is actually Jonas, and it's this plea from Hoodsey that inspires Jonas to finally work up the courage to face his family once again, allowing Carl to finally get his Christmas wish.
That ain't Santa Claus. It's my father. I'd know that truck anywhere.
I don't think that this was his wish, at least not anymore, based on the first line of dialogue that he throws at Jonas upon their reunion.
Get in.
I would, but see, my mom always warned me about getting in the car with a total stranger.
While As Told by Ginger, even up to this point, hasn't been afraid to pull its emotional punches, this was the moment where I truly felt like the show won me over completely. Given the setup that led to this interaction, one could have expected the reunion of these two to be a little less, well, awkward.
I'm violently allergic to peanuts.
Oh, well, it's the thought that counts, Carl.
Yeah, I guess.
But that's not who these characters are, and that's not even reality. Knowing Carl, you couldn't expect him to just run into his dad's arms and have everything be okay. But they had to make it apparent to us that Jonas isn't someone who deserves to be suddenly welcomed back into his family, and I don't think that Jonas believes that he deserves that either. People are inherently fallible, and not everyone deserves to be forgiven immediately. It's something that you need to earn by putting in the effort to grow, and that's precisely what Jonas does in future episodes, maintaining a healthy enough distance from his family, but at the same time, showing up and offering support when he's reached out to. Carl may view him as a villain, while Ginger views him through a more forgiving and sympathetic lens, but ultimately, he's depicted in a way where we're able to view him as neutrally as possible. He's not a perfect person, nor does he pretend to be one. Through the way that he's even drawn, it's almost like you can see the amount of deep-seated regret that he carries around with him, and I think that's what prevents him from allowing himself to be present in their lives.
Just because he wasn't all that reliable in the past, well, that doesn't mean he's always going to be that way, right? I mean, people change.
Now that we have all of the pieces out on the board, it's time to shift our gaze towards the story and themes of As Told by Ginger, starting with...
Hi, Ginger, it's me. I'm grounded for a month and Macie is hyperventilating, but I just wanted you to know that absolutely everyone is talking about you.
To once again mention All Grown Up, it felt so much easier to conclude the video by the time that I finished analyzing the main characters, as they all pretty much stayed the same from start to finish. There was no genuine character development, despite the very concept of the show itself trying to convince you otherwise. But in the case of As Told by Ginger, we see not only Ginger, but the entire Foutley family change as people. And so, I feel it necessary to now go through the major plot beats of the show, or rather focus our attention towards the journey of their growth, with Ginger naturally being at the center of it all. Season 1 provides the most surface-level coming-of-age storylines in the series, and they don't honestly contribute too much to the show's overarching story. That isn't to say that Season 1 isn't important as a whole. It does an excellent job at delivering on the promises that Kapnick said this series would focus on. Ginger's entire character arc in Season 1 is about experiencing these milestone moments that bring about these feelings of uncertainty within her. Getting invited to a cool kids party, the prospect of having her first kiss, wanting to shave her legs. But all of this feels more like set dressing to me, as every now and again, we're provided with a few inklings of insight that hint towards the person that Ginger will end up becoming by the story's conclusion. All of these moments will inevitably lead Ginger down the path that she's destined for, but there are a few that feel absolutely key in hindsight. The first episode of significance to me is Hello Stranger. As previously mentioned, this is the episode where Ginger writes the poem about her dad for the Fall Arts Festival. Previously discussed plot points aside, what stands out immediately is that Ginger's teacher, Miss Zorsky, says this to her at the beginning.
The arts fair is rapidly approaching, and I promised a Foutly original in the flyer.
I know.
Up until now, the only indication that we've had about Ginger's writing abilities has been through her journaling, which doesn't necessarily communicate that this character would have some sort of secret writing talent. At least that's how I see it. So for Miss Zorsky to make a point of mentioning that a Foutly original poem is a major selling point for the festival itself feels quite significant, even though Ginger seems to shrug it off for the most part, as her thoughts are much more focused on her dad. She channels those emotions into her writing though, and come time for the showcase, her poem is exceptional, proving that Miss Zorsky wasn't just simply gassing her up for no reason.
Hello, stranger. Not a moment too soon. See, that old picture's fading in the drawer of my room.
Ginger's talent is visible, but she doesn't seem to realize it yet, as the changes in her life are just too distracting right now. And for a while after this episode, nothing really changes much for Ginger. Carl, however, does get to receive some proper closure in regard to Maud's passing, which comes from him and Hoodsey summoning her spirit on Halloween night.
It's about time you called.
Yeah. So while As Told by Ginger is realistic in a vast number of ways, all bets are off the table when it comes to anything involving Carl, as this is just the nature of his life as a person who is attracted to all things that are weird. There are only a small handful of times when something supernatural occurs. They don't really get too crazy, thankfully, but much like a lot of things with his sister this season, this does hint to some things later on for him. Maud and Carl have an endearing heart-to-heart, but once the ghost of Maud leaves, you can tell that Carl got the closure that he needed. And what this shows to us is that despite Carl coming across initially as the immature younger brother archetype, he gets to prove time and time again that he's actually much deeper than that. Lois got some closure as well from Maud's visit, as she was worried that her dinner was what killed Maud, but her reaction to seeing the ghost of Maud feels a bit more normal than Carl's.
It wasn't your mushroom caps that killed me. Between you and me, I think it was the rash.
I also want to mention once more Season 1's holiday special, as I do think it's worth to briefly mention once again as a reminder for things to come, mostly because it's the start of Jonas being a more recurring character in the show and how he re-enters the lives of his family.
Dad?
Well, if it ain't Father Christmas.
We know that Carl's reaction to seeing him is mixed, as he carries a lot of pent-up resentment and anger towards him. What Jonas did is never divulged, but it feels justified given how much we know about Carl by this point. But in the case of Ginger, she is much happier to see him. After this, Jonas does have more of a presence in the story, although this is his first and last appearance in Season 1. Fast forwarding now all the way to the Season 1 finale, Summer of Camp Caprice. Ginger, Dodie, Macie, and Courtney spend the summer at Camp Caprice, an all-girls summer camp that they choose to go to every year, except for Courtney, who decided to go at the last minute as a way to spite Miranda for questioning her grit. She's mostly just there to provide her usual brand of unfiltered commentary.
We are proud, 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 so we sing our song aloud.
It's very annoying.
Shortly after Ginger arrives, she goes out to the stables to see her favorite horse at the camp, and as she's about to feed it an apple, she gets stopped by the new stable hand, Sasha. This dude's introduction is what I believe to be the first major turning point for Ginger's character moving forward, as up until now, Ginger has not had a crush on someone as intensely as this. She falls very fast for Sasha, largely due to just having something in common with him right out of the gate. While the only reason that she really liked her main crush for Season 1, Ian Richton, was because she just thought that he was cute, not because she related to him in any way. And that isn't a bad thing, it just demonstrates the universal shallowness of middle school crushes, as you don't really have your type figured out just yet. But when you actually meet someone for the first time that is genuinely interested in you as a person, Cupid straight up just swings at you with a bag of bricks and you can't even process what's happening. And that's precisely what happens to Ginger. Later that night, the girls start discussing their summer goals at the campfire, and as Ginger drools over Sasha from across the way, the wheels in her brain begin to turn, eventually leading her to write a song about how she felt when meeting Sasha for the first time, which means that this is the second time that Ginger is using her creativity to process the complicated emotions that she's experiencing. Much like in Hello Stranger, these two elements, romance and creativity, are the biggest contributors to Ginger's character development throughout the entire course of the series. She's someone who is best able to process her emotions through the creation of art, But at this point in the story, she's not yet realized it. Granted, I don't think most kids would immediately recognize this kind of messaging until a bit later in life, but at the same time, it's entirely possible for kids to take a page out of Ginger's book when grappling with their own emotions and finding a way to channel it into something creative. This is, however, the start of her artistic journey, and because this is the beginning, the song that she writes for Sasha is rough.
There were copper-colored ponies. There was air that smelled like rain.
Okay, good. That's pretty good. All right.
It's okay that it's rough though, because a lot of these sudden feelings of infatuation that she has for Sasha are a lot to process, whereas the poem about her father came about from thoughts and feelings that Ginger had actual years to process. It's natural for it to come out rough, especially when you take into consideration that she's adding the element of music as well. But regardless, this marks a huge milestone in her journey towards self-actualization, as she leaves Camp Caprice happy with the memory of her time with Sasha firmly rooted in her mind. And it's going to stay there for quite a while, as we now head into Season 2.
That's great. Oh, gross. That's a gift.
The first episode of Season 2 starts with a cling, as Darren gets the handsome Squidward treatment.
Darren, you're hot.
Making almost every girl at Lucky Junior High collectively turn their heads whenever he passes them in the halls. But it's Miranda who actively pursues him. The two only end up dating for this episode, as who would have guessed, they make a terrible couple. But while there aren't any long-lasting events or consequences that occur because of this episode, I do feel like this new look for Darren marks a change for the status quo of As Told by Ginger, as this season starts to slowly but surely crank the dial of maturity forward into more complicated and serious subject matter, a lot of which derives from the increase of hormones and all of the anxiety and drama that gets brought along with it. All Grown Up never wanted to get too specific when it came to any episodes that involved the onset of puberty. They would lightly broach some sensitive subjects, but they'd never dig too deep, likely due to this show being so attached to the Rugrats brand and that causing hesitancy. But meanwhile in Ginger, we were given an episode about the mandatory health film in gym class, Ginger getting actually slut-shamed through the spreading of a false rumor, as well as the awkwardness and sometimes pain that comes from love triangles. Other than this dude who only ever appears in one episode, Ginger is still very much stuck on Sasha throughout most of Season 2. Even if she doesn't talk about him until the episode where they finally get to see each other again, I do think that the lack of actual love interests for her in this season heavily suggests that she's still thinking about him. And it's in episode 15 of the season, Ginger Solo, where they get to finally reunite since Camp Caprice. Ginger hears that the school's marching band is preparing for a competition in Heathered Hills, which is conveniently where Sasha goes to school. She jumps at the opportunity to join, being assigned to the Extra Grande Triangle, which I was sad to find out isn't a thing apparently. If it is though, I would love for you to fact check me in the comments because I want to believe. It is worth mentioning, however, that Sasha has basically ghosted Ginger.
Ginger, Sasha has not returned any of your letters or phone calls.
But that doesn't stop Ginger from making excuses for his lack of response. Skipping ahead to the day of the competition, Ginger manages to bump into him almost immediately, and take note of the way that this guy just tried to run away at the sight of her.
Now the main problem area is up here. All of this going on up here is what's causing me the most physical discomfort. It's like a visceral reaction of discontent coming from this area.
Unaware of how clearly uncomfortable he is, Ginger asks for proper time to catch up later, which he reluctantly agrees to do. And once the time comes and they get to talking, their conversation gets interrupted by a girl who turns out to be Sasha's girlfriend. Prompting Sasha to pull the old, I didn't know how to tell you card on Ginger. This of course breaks Ginger's heart to the point where even Miranda tries to console her, in her own Miranda way at least.
You actually cheered me up.
And the joy I feel for having done so is positively overwhelming.
There seems to be a passionate hatred for Sasha among fans, and while yes, I agree, f this guy, I want to mention a sentiment that I've shared before about how As Told by Ginger makes characters that you're supposed to dislike, even if they aren't necessarily the villains. Miranda is a villain, but Sasha is a classic example of a teenage boy who doesn't have the emotional intelligence or courage just yet to handle letting Ginger down respectfully. Teenage boys are just idiots, and I can confirm that because I was once one of them as well, but now I'm old.
It'll happen to you.
That's not to say at all, though, that Sasha gets a pass or that Ginger should have taken the cues a bit more seriously and just disengaged. But these kinds of things happen all the time when you're a kid, and they suck. Which is why it's important to show it happen in this kind of story, because you honestly do learn a lot from it as a result. It's just a part of life. Not a good part, but a part nonetheless. This is the most significant event that Ginger goes through in season 2. And while it does seem like she bounces back rather quickly, 2 episodes later, we get the episode entitled, And She Was Gone. A light trigger warning, by the way, for the reasons that are listed on screen. If you would like to skip this section, then go ahead and fast forward to the displayed timecode. I talked a little bit about this episode earlier, as this is the one where Carl develops his crush on Noelle, and she officially enters the story. And while I'm talking about Carl, I just want to mention that I haven't forgot about him. It's just that meeting Noelle is honestly the most noteworthy event for him in all of season 2. There will be more to say about him once we dive into the 3rd season. But anyways, the title of this episode doesn't actually come from Carl making Noelle disappear. It actually is the title of a new poem that Ginger has written for a competition. This feels a bit similar to Hello Stranger in season 1, making me feel like this is a follow-up to that episode in a way. Ginger takes to the typewriter, ready to let her soul spill out onto the page, telling the story of a girl who is experiencing a tremendous amount of pain and sorrow. She turns in her paper to Miss Sorsky to review it, and after she reads it, she sits Ginger down and encourages her to see the school psychologist, because Ginger essentially wrote a poem about suicide without even realizing it. The sudden concern coming from Miss Sorsky ends up making Ginger feel concerned as well, because up until this point, she was really excited about this poem. But even after reading it to both Dodie and Macie, as well as Courtney and Miranda too, she's only met with more concern for her well-being.
If I'd have known you were, like, clinically depressed, I might have gone a little easier on you.
I honestly love this episode for a number of reasons. One of the biggest being the eerie sequence that they have for whenever Ginger is reciting pieces from the poem. It's quite ominous and perfectly conveys the emotion that's being interpreted out of the writing. But I think it's also incredibly admirable that the show had the guts to even allude to such a sensitive subject. Ginger isn't even suicidal. The real issue here is less about what she wrote and more about how everyone at school, faculty included, is looking at her differently and making her feel uncomfortable for simply writing a sad piece of poetry. That's not to say that these kinds of things shouldn't be taken seriously, but the lack of transparency they're disclosing to Ginger without providing more clarity in regard to their concern only confuses her more.
What's with the total alarmist attitude? Can a kid lie on the couch apathetically without it being like a national emergency?
It isn't until the end of the episode when she has her mom read the poem that Lois is able to put Ginger's mind more at ease.
You're a bright, sensitive young woman. The kind of person who understands people's feelings. Which is why you can write about them so beautifully.
I think that Ginger was going through a lot when she wrote this poem, and she channeled those locked up feelings into words on a page, much like how many artists express themselves through what they create. Lois has already recognized Ginger's gift for writing, but she is also aware that the words on the page don't always point towards a larger issue, as she knows Ginger well enough that if she were truly hurting, she knows that her mom is always there to turn to for support. There's something else that's worth discussing about that closing moment between Ginger and Lois, which is that this season places a very heavy emphasis on the importance of family.
It's about family, and that's what's so powerful about it.
I didn't notice it at first, between all of the teenage drama happening with our younger characters. But even if some of these episodes seem to not carry much plot relevancy after their 23-minute run times, they do each contribute to a large piece of As Told by Ginger's identity. There's 2 specific episodes that I want to highlight, the first of which being the episode entitled Family Therapy. As previously mentioned in her character breakdown, this show does a great job early on of getting you to like Macie. Not only is she great comic relief, but she manages to come across as such a fragile person, which makes you sympathize with her all the more when things suddenly get rough for her. It's in this episode that her 13th birthday is coming up, and everyone is wondering what kind of party her parents are going to throw for her to celebrate. But when the day finally arrives, Ginger gets a call from Macie, who sadly tells her that her parents just forgot that it was her birthday.
What parent could possibly forget their own child's birthday?
Turns out, bye.
This should have happened to Dodie. Now we end up learning a lot about Macie and her family, with the first being that her parents are actually family therapists, which is just hilarious given the circumstances. There's this great moment when the girls go to confront them while they're at work, and when Macie tries to get through the receptionist, she comes back with this line.
The doctors will see me! Great!
When? 10 weeks from tomorrow.
Wow, 20 plus years later and the American healthcare system is still failing us. It's worth noting, though, that Macie's special brand of confidence that we saw on full display in the Little Seal Girl doesn't seem to get extended towards her parents, requiring Ginger to take the initiative in confronting them on the issue. Instantly, they know they messed up, apologizing and vowing to make up for all of the other major milestones in Macie's life that they were too busy for. But that's only halfway through, as the rest of the episode consists of Macie's parents throwing her a barrage of birthday parties for all of the lost years.
I'm proud of you. I'm loving you, and I'm supporting you.
Essentially infantilizing her and not treating her like she just became a teenager. But when Ginger brings up all of her concerns, Macie gets very defensive, as she has been enjoying all of the attention from her parents. And that kind of makes sense, given that parental love has been something that she's been deprived of for apparently a very long time. Sure, it's weird and a bit concerning that she's into all of these more childish birthday parties, but it makes sense given the context. And even when Ginger goes to her mom about all this, Lois throws this at her.
She told me to butt out. But I'm sure it's all about wanting to please her parents.
Did you ever think maybe you're the only one feeling that way?
Eventually, after the final birthday party ends up being a success to everyone there, Ginger goes to apologize to Macie. And not only does she accept Ginger's apology, but she does acknowledge that it is time to come back to the present, which I have to say is another resolution coming from Macie that caught me off guard. It's not as well executed as the ending to the Little Seal Girl episode, but I do like how Macie is aware enough to realize when she's ready to tap out and be real with her parents again. Even if she wasn't the most confident at the start of the episode, she certainly ends it with a new perspective that feels very in character for her. Macie isn't the only one with parental issues though. As in the episode Mommy Nearest, Courtney's mother finds herself having to go through an extensive stay at the hospital due to a botched plastic surgery procedure.
I hope these cheer you up, Mrs. Griffling.
Naturally, Courtney is responding rather dramatically to this, feeling powerless in helping her mother in any meaningful way besides allowing her the time to heal. This is also happening at a time when Ginger has been prioritizing time with her friends more so than time with her mom, declining an invite from Lois to run errands together after she clocks out. Lois doesn't take any offense to this, but in a surprising turn of events, she returns home with Courtney. This throws Ginger off for a second, sparking a bit of jealousy, but Courtney soon reveals to her how lonely she feels without her mom around, as she is the only support system in her life. Her dad doesn't even show up in person until the series finale of the show. He does show up at one point. Granted, he's a disembodied voice on the phone, but he's there.
Well, hello, Ginger. Nice to meet you.
But upon learning this, Ginger decides to extend an olive branch to Courtney by inviting her to stay with them for the rest of the week. And things get a bit weird.
I don't want to be a burden to you and Mama.
Huh?
I mean, your mother.
The absence of her mother makes Courtney project her daughterly desires onto Lois, making Ginger have to compete with her for Lois's attention. And Courtney is running circles around her, making Ginger lash out pretty aggressively, hurting Courtney's feelings and forcing her to leave. If there is one thing that we know about Courtney, it's that she is always over the top in almost everything that she does. But this episode does a great job in shining some light on her humanity. Even if she is this icon of idealism to so many kids at Lucky Junior High, she is still just a kid who needs to be cared for. And sure, it's fun to laugh at snobby rich people. You already know that I love doing that. But Courtney is capable of being more than just a caricature. Her upbringing, while desirable from the outside looking in, is definitely an isolated one. Whereas Ginger seems to have everything that Courtney wishes she had. Perhaps this is the reason behind Courtney extending that fated invitation to her birthday party in the first place. Because the more that we get to know her, the more we realize that while she certainly can't give up the luxurious lifestyle that her family has made her accustomed to, she can tell that there might be more to life. Through this whole saga with Courtney, Ginger was able to come out of it with a better appreciation for her mom, bringing them closer together so that they can be better prepared for all of the life changes that are about to come their way. And while we're talking about Lois, I'd be remiss to mention an important string of events regarding her and even Carl to a lesser degree prior to closing out our season 2 analysis. And these events are centered around both of their love lives, which differ significantly from what we have watched Ginger go through this season. Starting with Lois, we see her at the end of season 1's holiday special, sharing a bit of an awkward moment under the mistletoe with Jonas. This is the only moment in the show that could imply that something is still there between them, and I'm glad that it is, because it would honestly just feel regressive for both of them, especially when you take into consideration where each of them are in life. Jonas, by the way, only makes one cameo in Season 2, which was in the previously mentioned episode from Hoodsey's breakdown, losing Nana Bishop. But Ginger is the only one who interacts with him in that episode, which is perfect because that's the only relationship that he really needs to be focused on rekindling going forward.
Made up for the fact that my real dad was such a disappointment. Just running a family.
Given everything that Lois has gone through up until this point in her life, she has developed an acute awareness for what her tolerance level for bullshit is. And that level is reached very quickly after she starts dating a local handyman named Buzz, whose only saving grace is that he's voiced by Tom Kenny.
Well, it's all in the wrist. Firm but gentle. Show 'em who's boss.
And how?
Buzz and his sons don't last very long, as they cross multiple lines with Lois over and over again, and the only reason that he was given so many chances to begin with is that Ginger implored Lois to stay with him out of fear that she'd end up alone if she didn't just settle.
What the hell?
Those fears, however, are quickly laid to rest after one of the doctors from the hospital, Dr. Dave, stops by immediately after her breakup with Buzz. But once she invites him in, they begin sharing their likes and dislikes with each other, which makes for a very sweet and funny moment.
I don't like to encourage roughhousing.
I like occasional roughhousing, but I am allergic to fennel.
Good enough.
After this episode, Dr. Dave sticks around for good, and these two go on to serve as an excellent example for what a healthy relationship should look like. Unlike where Ginger is currently at, and even Carl to an extent, Lois and Dave have been around long enough to know what they want, and they know that it's easier to just be honest in what they're looking for up front, instead of starting and finding out later. And that's a very good model to set for pretty much any single viewer, regardless of whatever age they might currently be. After all, it's important to find someone who loves you for the person you are and all of the craziness that you might bring into a relationship. Surprisingly unrelated to that last sentence though, Carl in this season is a different story. As mentioned earlier in this video, Carl develops a crush later in the season on a girl named Noelle Sussman, who is just as weird as he is. It hasn't been since Mod that we have seen Carl infatuated with anyone, and thankfully Noelle is actually the same age as Carl. But the interesting thing at play here is that age is a factor in a much more conventional sense, as the feelings that they both have for one another are much more difficult to internally define for them. Like most grade school crushes, kids don't really know how to properly react to these new and complicated feelings. And to mix that in with Carl's weird sense of personal pride, on top of the guilt that he feels for believing that he banished someone he could have had a future with, it ends up making quite an overwhelming internal struggle for him. Suddenly, his ego is dropped, and we're starting to see a more desperate and childlike response coming from him. And while this is all happening, Hoodsey can't seem to grasp why it's upsetting Carl so much until he says this.
She was like my soulmate, Carl!
Soulmate or not, this feels like a huge moment of growth for Carl, mostly because he's never given so much thought to both a person's well-being and the consequences of his own actions, especially someone that he has little to no prior history with, making the relief that he feels at the end of the episode come across to us as all the more significant when he is finally reunited with Noelle. Their story doesn't truly start though until the first episode of Season 3, which I think is a pretty good indicator that it's time to move forward into the final season of As Told by Ginger.
So what's your thing?
I'm a writer, I guess.
Cool. I'm a fine artist.
We are officially in the end game now, as Season 3 brings a lot of change to not just Ginger's life, but to her friends and family as well. All that has been previously discussed seems to culminate in a season that doubles down on everything that we've come to expect from this show. And all of this starts with the 3-part season premiere, Foutley's on Ice. In this 3-parter, Ginger has applied to a fellowship program that if she gets accepted into, then it means that she'll be spending a semester at Avalanche Arts Academy, a prestigious school that's far away from sheltered shrubs, but would ultimately help guide her towards growing as an artist. And to the shock of almost no one, she gets in.
Ginger Foutley!
It's me?
You kinda knew it was gonna turn out that way.
Naturally, Dodie's the only one who's really shocked by this, and she's very inconsiderate about the entire situation.
It doesn't add up. It's not like she invented a cure for the common cold or something.
It's all petty drama that doesn't really matter, as they reconcile by the end of the episode. But it takes the whole f***ing episode! Unbeknownst to Ginger, however, her acceptance into the program was apparently based on a bribe organized by Miranda and Macie. Her? I know that this might seem like she's more important than I let on, but really she's not. Her existence is really just to hate Ginger alongside Miranda now. This is about as relevant as she gets. This plot against Ginger makes no sense to me though. The idea is that they want to get rid of her for good by having her enroll as a full-time student at the school of her dreams, which comes with the assumption that she would ultimately cut all ties with her friends back home, which feels like a very misguided assumption to make. But without even taking that into consideration, sending your so-called arch nemesis to a school where they can actually refine their skills and have a better chance at pursuing their dreams just seems like a pretty cool thing to do on your part, nefarious intentions aside. Honestly, the B-plot for part 1 feels a lot more important, as Carl has his eyes set on entering himself into the weird human Winterfest.
I gotta come up with something really unique, truly weird.
While at first he's focused on making himself pass the bar for entry, his plans change when he discovers that Noelle has secretly possessed telekinetic powers this entire time. And not only does this excite Carl beyond belief to learn that Noelle has such a gift, but he decides that she's going to be his ticket into the contest. And she agrees, but mostly because she just wants to make him happy. They earn their spot, and that concludes part 1. Part 2 begins with Ginger's goodbye party being thrown by Macie and Miranda.
Goodbye, Ginger! Goodbye, Ginger! Goodbye, Ginger!
Everyone is sad to see her go, especially Courtney, who got her a
It's Courtney! What the hell?
As the party goes on, Darren, Dodie, and Macie start talking, and Darren says this.
Look, you two, no one loves Ginger more than me, but that's exactly why I want what's best for her.
Which prompts Dodie and Macie to lose their shit. So this is the point where I feel like I need to come clean. I'm not sure how unpopular of an opinion this is, but I don't like that they set up Ginger and Darren to be a couple. And I think that a lot of it has to do with this moment. My boy Darren can't just say that he loves his lifelong friend platonically without their mutual friends being like, After all, he already established early in season 1 that he only sees Ginger as a friend and is content with things staying that way. And for such a casual line to be his big aha moment in realizing his true feelings, I can't help but find it to be a bit shallow and forced. Sure, he really does take some time to consider it after Ginger's departure, but I feel like it would have been more effective if he had made the discovery himself and not had Macie and Dodie forcing the thought into his head first. But while Darren is stewing on his thoughts and having awkward talks with his parents, Ginger heads to Avalanche Arts and immediately meets a dude by the name of Fred.
I'm Fred.
I'm embarrassed.
He's no Sasha, but he is intended to be a romantic rival for Darren. Meanwhile, with Carl, they need to have an adult chaperone for the competition, but since nobody knows about their plans or Noelle's powers, one of them has to act as the adult of the group. And that job gets automatically thrown onto Hoodsey. But then Noelle decides that in order to give him the aura of a man, he needs to grow up just a little quicker. And her solution is to just plant one on him.
Hello, children.
This kiss ends up hurting Carl deeply, which is unfortunate because the only reason that she's agreeing to do this contest in the first place is because she knows it's going to make Carl happy. The entire experience has now been soured for Carl, backing out of the plan entirely and icing both Hoodsey and Noelle. And that concludes part 2. We are now in part 3, the finale to this whole saga. And we open on Darren boarding a train to Avalanche County so that he can tell Ginger how he feels in person. And when he finally does reach her, Ginger is both confused and embarrassed at his sudden appearance. Hurt by Ginger's reaction, Darren proceeds to wander off into the night as a blizzard quickly approaches. Ominous, but nothing actually comes out of it. It turns out that he was fine and that there was nothing to worry about, leading up to the moment where they share their first kiss. Even if I wasn't a fan of the way that their romance was initiated, I can't say that I don't find the moment to be sweet, and I'm sure that at the time of its airing, this was a very big deal for longtime viewers of the show. A quick side tangent, but even though I wasn't watching this show at the time, I did vaguely remember the commercials that were promoting this special, so I did some digging until I found it. And while I can't play the commercial without definitely getting copyright stricken, I'm pleased to say that they used Complicated by Avril Lavigne for it. I'll leave a link in the description for those curious. But anyway, the special ends with Ginger saying goodbye to Darren, and remaining at Avalanche Arts for the remainder of the semester to work on improving as an artist. And the way that Carl's story resolves here is that he gets caught by Noelle and Hoodsey after stowing away on the bus to the Weird Human Winterfest. They try to talk to Carl, and Noelle does her best to tell him the truth about her feelings towards him, but he refuses to listen, leading to him ending up in actual mortal danger as the frozen water below him starts to crack. But it's okay, because Noelle saves him in the end with her telekinesis. And they make up in the end, taking the train back home with Darren. Now, the reason why I felt it so necessary to spend so much time on this one special, aside from how big of a deal it was for Ginger and Darren to finally get together, is that for the next chunk of episodes, things start to get a bit more frustrating. Season 3, while being perhaps the most engaging season of the series, suffers from some questionable choices in regard to pacing. There is a lot that happens coming off of this season premiere, and my best guess as to why is because of the team's awareness of the show's unfortunate cancellation. They were given one season to wrap things up, but they still had a lot of ground to cover if they wanted to give this show a proper ending. Over the span of the next 5 episodes, we get Carl and Noelle's sudden breakup, which I do think was very clumsily done, but at the very least, I do feel like this choice was made in order to further his character in a much deeper way, leaving his older sister to deal with all of the relationship drama this season. And also during this period of time, Lois and Dr. Dave get engaged, and this should feel like a big moment, as it very much so is intended to be, seeing as how the final episode of the show literally has the word wedding in the title. But unfortunately, the significance of this moment, as well as the lead up towards it, feels completely secondary in comparison to what is happening with Ginger and Darren. Obviously, I know that she's been and always will be the main character, but this feels like such a disservice to the supporting cast. Because now that the series is on a timer, the writers are trying their damn best to quickly develop and get you to feel invested in her relationship with Darren. But even then, that whole arc suffers from questionable pacing as well, to the point where an episode literally didn't have enough time to wrap up the story. I'm specifically talking about the episode Wicked Game. Ginger's back at Lucky Junior High, but she's more focused on spending time with Darren than anyone else. And guess who's mad about this?
If he thinks he's taking over my territory, he's got another thing coming.
Of course. Of course. It's Dodie. It's always Dodie. Why does it always have to be Dodie? So Dodie ends up scheming with Miranda and Macie to break Ginger and Darren up, with them even pressuring Macie into joining in on the plan as well. Courtney coincidentally walks in on the group in the bathroom as they're conspiring their master plan, and she promptly clues Ginger in.
There is no greater fury than that of a BFF scorned. And whether you choose to believe it or not, yours are conspiring against you.
But being the surprisingly good friend that she has become, Courtney plays double agent and secretly patches Ginger and Darren into one of their phone meetings.
Which should really stir things up between her and Darren.
Thanks, Courtney. I've heard enough.
Now you'd think that this kind of moment would be a segue into the third act of the episode, but by the time that Ginger hangs up, we got about a minute left, and it just ends with this message from Dodie.
Look, I know you don't want to talk to me right now, and I don't blame you. But I have so many things that I want to say. Starting with, I am so sorry.
And it was at this moment that I thought, okay, it's a two-parter, I guess. Nope. Because then the following episode opens on this scene.
It's fine, it's just
Hey Ginger, why the f*** are you hanging out with Dodie right now? The only mention of the previous episode's events are when Courtney, who is again showing that she is the better friend, reminds Ginger of it after Dodie is continuing to be self-entitled over other things that I just don't have the bandwidth to go over at this point, mostly because it involves her mom, and I have purposely been avoiding her for the entire length of this video.
Get back,
Bishops aside, the foundation of Ginger and Darren's relationship is built upon these first few episodes of the season, but it's just not enough. And this creates, at least for me, a lack of care when it comes to their success as a couple. I cared much more about Carl and Noelle, honestly, but in the next 2 episodes, No Turning Back, parts 1 and 2, they break up and their time together basically concludes from there. All because Noelle, for some reason, bet Carl away to another girl named Polly Schuster, who is the bird equivalent to a horse girl. Ew. But these 2 episodes are really about Ginger's fears in regard to how things are going to change as she and her friends graduate from junior high and prepare for high school. Everyone seems to be getting pulled in different directions, with Darren in particular getting roped into football due to his family reputation. He's not into the idea of joining at first, but after being given so much initial praise and attention from the coach, he gets motivated very quickly. Something to remember for later, but moving on. Ginger finds a moment to talk with her dad about her fears for the future, and he imparts some pretty good words of wisdom.
Here's the thing. The tighter you hold on to something, especially something that needs change and growth, the more great a chance you stand of losing it. I think I might have learned that the hard way.
I gotta say, whenever Jonas gets these kinds of moments where he can actually be a parent to Ginger, you can tell that he's speaking from a different place than Lois. As if you can tell that from the way he's speaking, you can easily imagine the kinds of things he went through in order to gain this wisdom, and how it likely came from a place of genuine reflection. Jonas clearly has a lot of regrets in his life, and not being a true father sooner is certainly one of them. So it makes me happy to see these 2 start connecting in a healthy way, and it's this conversation that helps Ginger reframe this next step forward. And come time for graduation, with Lois, Dr. Dave, and even Jonas in attendance to see her enter this new chapter, she doesn't feel so scared of the future anymore. But you know, maybe she should.
What'd I tell ya?
There are only 2 episodes of summer this season, and the first one involves Ginger and her friends once again returning to Camp Caprice. Even Courtney came back to be a camp counselor, which is kind of shocking to me. But hey, given the last few episodes, I'm fully convinced that she's the only person in Ginger's friend group that has experienced positive development over the last 2 seasons. Prior to their visit, Ginger is already lamenting that things with Darren are starting to feel different, and not in a good way. And considering the fact that she's going back to Camp Caprice, a run-in with Sasha is almost guaranteed. She's not even thinking about Sasha when she arrives, but it doesn't take long for him to start invading her mind like some sort of mind flayer parasite, creating an immense amount of guilt within her. And once he finally does make his presence known, and they get to talking, she makes the realization that what she was pining for wasn't specifically Sasha, because, let's be real, this guy, but she was missing the emotions that come from when you start a new relationship, which is to say that the honeymoon phase of her relationship with Darren has officially worn off.
Nothing can ever stay the same, so why do we expect it to? Instead, we should just enjoy it for what it is without ever taking it for granted.
While this episode frames this as something that isn't necessarily a bad thing, that you shouldn't expect things to always stay the way that they start out, especially when it comes to relationships, the episodes that follow only serve as more concrete evidence that these 2 are not a good fit for each other at all. The second episode of Summer, Fair to Cloudy, starts like many other episodes this season, Dodie getting mad about Ginger and Darren.
It clearly states that the best friend must get prior verbal approval before invading a girls-only event with said boyfriend, or it's an all-out conflict.
Could we not talk?
God bless you, Hoodsey. But while the last episode was meant to express the idea that it's okay for relationships to change over time, the biggest takeaways from this one are that Ginger is trying to force her interests onto Darren, and that Dodie still feels like Darren is a threat to her friendship with Ginger, specifically asking Courtney to tag along with them as a way to annoy Ginger. It all makes for a pretty frustrating watch, as Darren gets angry pretty quick, Ginger tries her best to convince him to have a good time, and Dodie is, well, Dodie. But nonetheless, it's important to bring up, as this feels like the first true nail in the coffin for their relationship. It's all downhill from here, folks. We are officially in the high school episodes now, and right out of the gate, it seems as though the mission here is to make Ginger suffer as much as possible, starting with the new Miss Orsky, who is the original Miss Orsky's cousin. And she is probably one of the cruelest teachers that I have ever seen in a Nickelodeon series. The mean teacher trope is nothing new to the network, but even the live-action equivalents to those kinds of characters are more cartoony than she is. And it adds a little extra salt to the wound, as she's the cousin of Ginger's former teacher and advocate, Ms. Zorsky. I'm not sure how much of a universal experience this may be for everyone else, but this reminds me of how each time I was about to advance into a new division of education, be it junior high, high school, or university, I'd always get some sort of spiel from my current teachers about how my future teachers were going to be a lot more critical and less forgiving to me, which is exactly how the new Ms. Zorsky is. But that was almost never the case. Even the teachers that I disliked weren't as awful as this woman is. But I think that she's meant to illustrate that point, to remind Ginger that she needs to step up her game now that she's in high school. The rest of her classes also seem to be throwing a ton of pressure onto her, and she's desperate to find a way to cope with the new workload, which is when she catches wind of a new drink being made at the local coffee shop called the
Loco Protinator!
Yeah, this episode is about addiction, which I don't really relate to in the slightest. God, how is there still so much video left? Ginger comes to rely on this drink, and it quickly ends up costing her, as most of the work that she's doing while under the influence is illegible due to how wired she is. But now that she's hooked, she needs the drink in order to function. This episode does end with Ginger being able to give up coffee, along with Lois, who also decides to kick her 3 cups a day habit.
You will make coffee for me. Now!
But the amount of pressure that Ginger is under still continues to grow. It's refreshing yet also disheartening to see such a bleak introduction to high school life for a character. Nobody's singing and dancing at this school, everyone is just kind of miserable. Carl also gets a bit of a rude awakening as well, now that he and Hoodsey are attending Lucky Junior High. He's truly doing his best to turn over a new leaf, but the principal has already given all of his teachers his file, which apparently cites an incident involving a remedial math class that was so bad, no one dares to even speak of it.
I feel I would be remiss if I didn't say, what you did to that remedial math class, that was wrong, Carl.
And this leads into his science teacher of all people trying to exact revenge on him for his daughter, who was apparently in that class.
And so an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth.
He sets up a trap to tempt Carl into breaking the rules, and once Carl caves, he reveals that the substance that he opened was a deadly disease, leading Carl to believe that he will now die as a result of his misconduct. Once the situation gets explained to Lois and David, they give Carl an exam for safety, but assure him that he's fine, leading to Lois being mad at both of her kids' schools for stressing them out so much. This whole debacle, though, leads to one of my favorite moments between her and Dr. Dave.
It's not too late, you know, to bow out. I mean, this is my life.
Well, Lois, since you put it that way.
Very funny.
God, at least someone is happy in this show right now. In the next episode, Darren's first football game is happening this weekend, and Ginger isn't honestly that excited about it. We knew already that sports were never much of an interest to her in the first place, but it seems like something more is going on here. And it's all the more apparent when we see the kind of person that Darren has become.
Bam, bam, bam!
Unlike Ginger, he's currently living the aforementioned romanticized version of high school now that he's the quarterback for the football team. He's practically turned into his older brother now, and that's not the kind of personality that Ginger was attracted to in the first place.
Pretty funny, huh? You know, but not in a ha-ha type of way.
And it seems like his newfound meatheadedness has made him unaware of the fact that his relationship is now on the rocks, as he's not even aware of how miserable Ginger seems nowadays. All of that aside though, Ginger can't actually go to the game now because she was given detention by the new Miss Zorsky. And instead of being truthful with him, which is, you know, the reasonable thing to do, they try to fool him into thinking that Ginger is there by having Dodie dress up like her.
They were copper-colored ponies.
But it doesn't work, pissing Darren off as this meant a lot to him. But her time in detention ends up being pivotal for her, as she spends the time doing what she does best. Writing. And after one of the girls there decides to snatch her notebook away and read it to everybody, it catches the attention of the guy sitting across from her, an upperclassman named Orion, who happens to be a musician. He looks over her lyrics and gives her a boost of encouragement, although feeling slightly awkward about mentioning her boyfriend. Ginger isn't the only one who has captured the attention of an upperclassman though, as a cheerleader by the name of Simone literally cartwheels over to Darren after the game and congratulates him on the victory. And it's obvious that this girl is very into him and that he's kind of into her as well. The dichotomy of Ginger and Darren's high school experiences are what I think make this final arc of Ginger so engaging. Most often in media that's aimed towards the young teen demographic, the very concept of what high school is tends to be blown way out of proportion, albeit sometimes it's done intentionally for the purpose of satire, but other times not so much. You don't have to look any further than Nickelodeon, or even Disney for that matter, to see how they constantly make high school out to be the high point of a person's life. And sure, for some people it definitely is. Darren and Will seem to be those kinds of people. Darren is a character who progressively became more popular as the series went forward. He only grew in ways that were purely aesthetic. He's still the same insecure kid from Piece of My Heart that refused to look outside of himself and consider what his friends were telling him. Ginger, on the other hand, has experienced heartbreak already. She's developed her skills as an artist, but is struggling to keep up with the expectations set by her teachers and her boyfriend, resulting in her burning out majorly. Out of the two of them, Darren is the one who is living the Nickelodeon/Disney dream of high school independence, while Ginger is experiencing the complete opposite. And I don't even think that what she's going through is realistic per se. It just fucking sucks. She has put in so much work to improve herself and is getting nothing in return, while Darren is handed the whole world on a silver platter. Yet at the same time, he's so mad that his girlfriend that he's been neglecting for weeks can't make it to his football game. If the first half of season 3 was to give the audience what they wanted, which was to see Darren and Ginger end up together and close out their middle school years by building up hope for the future, it's almost like the second half is telling us psych, and that these two aren't actually the best pairing given how much their worlds now differ from one another. And if you go back and recall those lyrics from the theme song about how the grass is much greener on the other side, it seems as though that no longer applies to Ginger's perception of Courtney and her way of life, because now it seems to more so reflect the realizations that Ginger and Darren are having about their relationship. And to be perfectly honest with you here, I kinda love it. As Told by Ginger has always been dramatic, but dramatic in a pretty innocent sense, which felt appropriate for where Ginger and her friends were in their lives. But to take their advancement into high school and use it as a way to make them, or more specifically Ginger, grow up in the most brutal yet still PG ways imaginable, while also managing to not completely backstep the development that these characters have experienced over the last 2 seasons. Not only that, but when we look at the issues that are plaguing Ginger and Darren, they all get juxtaposed to the development of Lois and Dr. Dave's relationship. Other than a future mother-in-law who hates her, she's the happiest that she's ever been in quite some time now that she's engaged to someone who loves and accepts both her and her kids for all the craziness that they bring. Okay, mostly Carl, but the point remains. The balancing act that this show performs by demonstrating what love is capable of doing to us makes for such an engaging watch, allowing us to see that regardless of wherever you may be in life, love can either uplift you in ways that you never expected or give way to some of the most painful feelings that you could possibly experience. It all just depends on finding the right person for you. So with that in mind, let's continue forward.
Oh, Clifford, Beth murmured in his ear. Wow, he made Beth murmur.
When Orion and Simone get introduced, what I thought was going to happen was that Ginger and Darren would start to naturally drift apart because, let's be real here, Orion and Simone make for much better romantic partners for the both of them, solely through their mutual interests alone. Orion is a singer and drummer in a local band, and can plainly see that Ginger has artistic talent and passion. Simone is confident, competitive, and just simply fits more easily into Darren's life. I know that Ginger and Darren have a history together, but the fact of the matter is that they are just completely different people by this point in the series.
Why can't you just accept that this is who I am?
I accept that football is who you are.
Then you'll come to my games. If you care about me, you'll come.
And I thought that it was going to lead to a pretty amicable yet still kind of sad breakup, and that they'd have to learn how to be friends again. But that's not what happens. Ginger desperately tries to cling to her relationship with Darren, while he continues to flirt with and get closer to Simone. Ginger isn't ever aware of this, but Dodie, who has a connection to the cheer team, not only witnesses their interactions, but is even asked about Darren by Simone.
Okay, tell me, what's his favorite food?
Well, he does love the corn.
One would think that knowing Dodie, she'd immediately blab about this to Ginger because she's Dodie, but in a very rare display of maturity and insight into the situation, she writes a letter to Darren, telling him that he needs to be a big boy and break up with Ginger. This is likely the only time that I will ever say this, but hell yeah, Dodie.
Congratulations! Congratulations!
Congratulations.
Congratulations!
Congratulations.
Congratulations!
Congratulations. Congratulations.
Leading up to the moment before their breakup, we are given a scene of Ginger singing a song that she wrote called Splinter in My Heart. We had a shorter version in the previous episode, but I think this one is more important to bring up, as it's now clear that Ginger has learned to really channel her emotions into both her writing and performance skills. I mean, compare this to the girl who sang Copper-Colored Ponies.
There were copper-colored ponies. There was air that smelled like rain. It's kinda sad, really. Guess I'm a sort who linger. When the credits roll, I still can't leave a picture.
Ginger has really grown as an artist. It's not great that Ginger is hurting as badly as she is here, but this is the reality of artistic growth. Not that you need to suffer, but much of your inspiration comes from your life experiences, be them positive or negative. And unfortunately for Ginger, she's dealing with a lot of negative these days. When Darren finally breaks up with her, despite Ginger's pleading that she will try harder, he manages to be as kind as possible about it.
I can try harder. I won't miss a game. I'll be there in the stands cheering you on. And
You'll be miserable. Both of us will. It's not who you are. You're Ginger Feltley, and you're opinionated and headstrong and wonderful, and you think football is stupid, and you're probably right.
Which I think shows that the Darren that we knew from the start of the series is still there. He doesn't want to break up with her in the sense that she's still someone that he cares about, but as far as being in a relationship goes, it just doesn't make sense anymore. They each take the breakup pretty hard, but in Ginger's case, she tells Dodie and Macie that it, quote, feels like my insides exploded, which is a pretty common feeling associated with heartbreak. But then hours later, Lois checks in on her and sees that she's unresponsive, and that's when we realize that the problem isn't actually her heart, it's a ruptured appendix, making that line she said earlier feel a little more on the nose now that I think about it. I'm actually using humor to cope, because this is the most intense episode of a Nickelodeon cartoon that I've ever seen. Dr. Dave is performing the surgery, determined to make sure that his future daughter-in-law makes it out okay, and as Ginger is given the anesthesia, we hear him say this.
I don't like the looks of that. There's an abscess formed around the rupture. There's some significant blood loss here. Let's confirm her blood type. We need suction. She's hemorrhaging!
What follows is a montage of Ginger's whole life, including the life that she still has yet to live, leading into her waking up from a successful surgery with not just her mom there, but her dad as well. David gives the three of them some time together, showing a little awkwardness at Jonas's presence, but knowing that he has every right to be there as Ginger's father. And as he stands there watching from the hallway, Carl approaches him in concern for Ginger, leading into what is perhaps my favorite moment in the entire series.
After all, that's your family in there.
You know, if it's all the same, Davo, I think I'd like to stay out here for a while. With you.
Not only is the sentiment from Carl exactly what David needed to hear, but it is such a profound moment for Carl as well. Even up to this point, Carl has really liked David, and a lot of that has to do with David's approach to being in Carl's life. He's a kind-hearted guy who's never really pushed onto the kids the idea that he's some sort of replacement for Jonas. Ginger has spent time rekindling her relationship with Jonas, and while she likes David and is very happy for him and her mom, you can tell that she doesn't really view him so much as a father. But unlike her, Carl has been craving a proper father figure for practically his whole life. He gave up on Jonas a long time ago and has no plans of letting him back in emotionally, but David has shown patience and understanding towards Carl, leading to this moment where Carl actively chooses David as his father. And the way that Carl subtly holds his hand at the end, something that feels so uncharacteristic of him, doing my best to not get choked up while recording this. But even though Carl is content to only have David for support, Jonas is now committed to being there for his daughter whenever she needs. He continues to visit her and even has a moment with David where they each express their mutual love for their family. It's a bit tense and awkward, as Jonas definitely feels inferior to Dr. Dave, knowing that he is not only Ginger's soon-to-be father-in-law, but also the man that saved her life, while all that he's able to do is simply be there for Ginger, something that he's only recently had the courage to actually do.
I love them, you know. All of them.
So do I.
But David at the same time feels uncertain about Jonas's presence, telling Lois that it's okay if she's having second thoughts given the circumstances and that he won't get in the way, but she's able to put his mind at ease.
He's not the man I'm in love with, David. You are.
Now that's romance.
Ginger also gets a variety of visitors to her room at the hospital, ranging from who you'd expect.
Oh, here's your get well song.
It isn't very long.
To old faces like the original Miss Sorsky and even Orion. Let me tell you, this dude is so smooth when he talks to Ginger, while at the same time being able to convey just how much he cares about her. It's hard for her though, as she's not able to fully embrace the fact that she's met this great person for her, as Darren is still at the forefront of her mind, especially because he's her only friend that doesn't come to visit her. He tries to, but the amount of guilt that he feels about the situation is too immense, which is understandable, even if it can all be chalked up to just incredibly poor timing. But the amount of distress that he is expressing over what's happened at least informs us that Darren is in fact still a good person. He's definitely a little misguided with his newfound popularity, but I don't believe that he was misguided in his decision to break up with Ginger. Breakups are fucking hard, dude. I get it. But when you have this much history with a person, it doesn't feel out of the realm of possibility for the two of you to eventually become friends again. These things just take time. But they're also high school freshmen, so all of that logic that I just talked about gets thrown out the window, because to kids, all of this feels so much more important than it actually is in the grand scheme of things. And this awkwardness between them unfortunately becomes the central conflict for the remainder of the series. I'm gonna be honest, it's tough to properly articulate my feelings towards the episodes that follow A Lesson in Tightropes, because that episode is by all accounts the climax of As Told by Ginger, as it manages to converge everyone's plot threads together through such a dramatic incident. Jonas has finally become the father that Ginger has always wished he would be. David has become the father figure that Carl has always wished to have. And Lois has assured David that he is now a part of this family and that her love for him is true. But the only person in this family that's lacking any sort of resolution is Ginger. And considering just how much she's been through ever since she started high school, you'd think that these last few episodes would help build her back up in order to prepare her for whatever challenge the finale will bring. But unfortunately, she just gets to suffer more. When she returns to school in the following episode, entitled Dodie's Big Break, we're treated to what's quite possibly the worst Dodie episode out of the entire series. If someone managed to still like Dodie up until this point, then this episode does a great job at turning you against her, as the plot revolves around her faking a broken leg in order to garner sympathy from the cheer squad. And it works. She becomes a member and somehow manages to become even more deplorable than ever before. I had my doubts for a while, but after watching this episode, I am undoubtedly convinced that even the writers hate Dodie as well. There's just no way that this is by accident, because Ginger, who is drawn in such a sickly way in this episode that you can't help but feel bad for her, is shown no respect for what she went through by anyone besides Macie. Miss Sorsky is still cruel to her, while Dodie, who is receiving everything that she's ever hoped for, all on the basis of a lie, makes this episode feel as though we've regressed back to Season 1 levels of pettiness, but on a much more depressing scale. And it only makes things worse that Ginger still sticks up for Dodie in the end. She doesn't deserve Ginger's friendship, and I'm just sick of it. But do you know what makes me happy? The fact that this is the last episode that's focused on Dodie. Let's go! That's right, we did it, viewer! The episode after, Battle of the Bands, is less offensive and more so just a downer, as the school is cutting funds to the band program in favor of giving the football team new uniforms, which naturally leads to a fight between Ginger and Darren, as Ginger supports the band program and Darren obviously supports football. The point of this episode is mostly to illustrate Ginger's resentment toward Darren over what happened, while also learning that when it comes to arts programs versus sports, it's always going to be a losing battle. Darren does end up being the bigger person at the the end, as he's able to recognize that he too has been petty about this whole situation, and also seeing Ginger in an ear costume was kind of sad. So he gets the team to come together and complain about the new uniforms that took the funding away, restoring the band's budget, and giving Ginger just a little bit of hope that Darren is still the same person that she once knew. The final episode prior to the finale, 10 Chairs, is a Thanksgiving episode, and it is a very mixed bag. The Foutleys and the Bishops are celebrating Thanksgiving together. David's mother is also going to be there. With so many people that are coming over, Ginger can't help but think, maybe I should invite one more person. So she decides to invite Jonas, secretly. Just doesn't tell anyone. On the one hand, I can understand her desire to invite her dad, given his persistence and finally showing up when it counts. He's put in the work and I think he does deserve to be there. But on the other hand, since she didn't tell anyone about this prior, his arrival comes as an awkward shock, especially to David's mother, who already has it out for Lois to begin with. But Carl is angry, Lois is uncomfortable, and they are all coming down on Ginger for making this happen. If anything though, this episode does serve to give Carl and Jonas a proper reconciliation, with many thanks in part to David for insisting that Carl be a little less critical of his dad. I may not enjoy this episode too much, but I have to say that David has once again given us the blueprint for how a positive step-parent should act in this kind of situation. But now, we have finally reached the 3-part series finale of As Told by Ginger, otherwise known as the wedding frame.
You are an invitation to the Foutley wedding, yet opening you creates a complex can of worms.
While the big event of this episode is Lois and David's wedding, there's still copious amounts of Ginger and Darren drama to get through, and honestly, I am pretty tired of it at this point. But I'm not gonna lie, I really want to see how this plays out. Ginger uses wedding planning for her mom as a defense mechanism here, as she isn't ready to fully commit to a relationship with Orion just yet. Her feelings on the very concept of love have been strained, questioning the validity of second chances at love, despite witnessing personally the strength of her mom and David's relationship.
I would characterize it more as a loss of faith than the notion of commitment.
Really?
And I am trying to sympathize with her here, I really am. But when Ginger is falling asleep on the couch and having Titanic music video dreams about Darren, I just can't help but roll my eyes.
I'll never forget you leaving me, no matter how hard I try.
But that isn't me saying that I don't care about Ginger and Darren as characters, and I understand that they are trying to illustrate the intensity of what high school heartbreak feels like. It sucks a lot, because you're basically unequipped to handle this sense of ache that you've never experienced before. But also, it's been enough time, Ginger. Get over it. He's not worth it. Just do yourself a favor and date Orion already. Or don't. There is no rule here that you have to be in a relationship in order to move on. Speaking of Darren, he's becoming less focused on his relationship with Simone and more aware of the increasing distance between him and Ginger on both an emotional and physical level, because the Foutleys are now moving into the same neighborhood as the Griplings, because Dave has got that doctor's salary and the year is also 2004. It's obvious that this is going to lead to their reconciliation in some sort of way, as the Pattersons have received an invitation for the wedding, and Darren is thinking really hard about whether this might be the olive branch that he's been so desperate for.
What? Well, you know, as an offering of peace.
After all, the amount of guilt that he's felt ever since her appendix burst has been brutal, and given their history prior to even dating, we know that they are each other's biggest support systems. Losing that feels more tragic than just breaking up romantically, so these feelings on Darren's part do feel justified. Sorry, this is going to be off topic for 1 second, but can we just appreciate all of the pictures that Will has of himself in his room?
Will?
I'm serious, kid. Say my name.
Will.
That's right, Chief.
Meanwhile, in the B-plot, someone is working in the shadows to break up Lois and David. It's just Mrs. Dave, David's mom, hiring a con artist by the name of Nikki Laporte to pose as one of his old flames.
Diane Francis.
Diane Francis from Pre-Med.
It's also worth mentioning that in the notes that I took for this special months ago, I said that Nikki Laporte had Jennifer Coolidge energy, and sure enough, she's voiced by Jennifer Coolidge.
Yeah, we both have so much in common. We both love soup. We love the outdoors.
The scheme involves capturing incriminating evidence of David with Nikki, sabotaging their honeymoon plans, and also apparently roofing Lois as well. I'm sorry, what did this accomplish? Nikki isn't the only character to come into town unexpectedly though, as we are treated to the surprise return of yet another Foutley, Monster the dog. Sensing the destruction of his former doghouse that became Carl and Hoodsey's base of operations, he manages to hitch a ride into town from Nikki. Listen, I don't know about you, but I am such a sucker for a good dog returning home plot. I watched both of the 90s Homeward Bound movies over 100 times easy growing up, so imagine the sheer amount of relief and excitement that I felt when it was revealed that Monster was in fact not dead, but very much alive and making his way back home. Obviously, there are a lot of side plots happening in this finale, all of which are attempting to provide closure however best they can, but there is one that I would have liked to have much more of an emphasis on in comparison to the others, which focuses on the fall of the Grippling Empire.
Business tycoon Prescott Grippling is being taken into custody on charges of insider trading.
We don't get a lot of time devoted to it, but it feels notable in the sense that the Gripplings are pretty much going through a life swap with the Foutleys, so much so that Blake humbly requests that they allow the Gripplings to take their house once they are all moved out. Once Ginger and her friends made their way into high school, Courtney somehow fell by the wayside in terms of relevancy, which is a bit of a bummer, as she brought so much comedic value to the series and it's a sad way for her to go out. Part of me does suspect that they may have included this small plot point in the finale as a way to potentially hold out hope for a Grippling-centered spin-off series, but I don't know if that would have even worked. I like Courtney and her family, but they don't feel like characters that are capable of having their own series dedicated to them.
I don't know whether to be fascinated or horrified.
Sorry, I've gotten off topic. But let's just speed our way through to the end now. To quickly summarize the other events that culminate towards this big wedding, Jonas has personally witnessed what he believes to be evidence of David's infidelity and plans to attest to the marriage. Noelle finds out about the supposed plot against the marriage and loops in Carl and Hoodsey to investigate. Ginger finally admits to Orion that she's unsure about committing to a relationship with him, and he cries sad boy tears. And Simone is growing more and more jealous of Ginger as Darren continues to neglect her. It wouldn't be a true finale to as told by Ginger though if we didn't get to watch at least one more heart-to-heart conversation between Ginger and Lois. Lois is going over her wedding vows and requests Ginger's assistance in proofreading them for her.
If it wasn't for you, I'd be a cynic of love who never shared laughter or my dishwashing glove.
The earnestness in her words comes across beautifully, even catching Ginger off guard, as she can sense from these words that her mom truly loves David.
If it wasn't for the way you filled my heart with glee, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be me.
And this inspires Ginger to reflect upon her feelings for Orion and the hesitancy that she's felt to take that risk. And so she decides to give Orion a chance, showing up to the wedding with him as a couple. Everyone truly seems to be attending this wedding, from the good Miss Orsky to Brandon to Prescott Grippling and a bunch of his fellow inmates to Miranda and Crazy Floyd. I didn't even talk about that episode.
Bark, 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 bark.
Never mind, it don't matter.
None of this matters.
Simone shows up as well, and this even catches Darren by surprise. She's also acting kinda sus, because she went to Miranda asking what to do about the situation between Darren and Ginger. It's weird though, because nothing comes about from her presence at all, likely due to them just running out of time by the end.
Hi, Simone. You look great.
That's literally it. Getting back to the actual wedding, you know how these kinds of things go. At the part where they ask if anyone objects, a ton of people start to get up, including Nikki Laporte and Jonas.
You know her?
He knows her all right. I saw them having coffee together.
Jonas, just sit down, you're embarrassing yourself. Thankfully, Noelle busts in to save the day, bringing along with her the woman that Nikki was pretending to be. And then to further prove the truth, Noelle also reveals that Nikki Laporte was actually... Wait a minute, how long is this video already? Oh my god. I don't want to keep you here for much longer, but this does feel like it could be a whole video essay in itself. So for the sake of time, I'll say this. I would like to believe that the character of Nikki Laporte was created with no ill will or intention towards trans individuals. They were simply meant to be a sleazy con artist archetype. However, this kind of characterization has definitely aged poorly when looking back on it through a modern lens. I am not an expert on trans representation in media whatsoever, but if anyone watching has constructive thoughts about this, I would definitely appreciate it if you could share it in the comments, because as I'm sure you know, representation is important. Okay. Moving forward. The best part though is that Carl and Monster are finally reunited, and as Monster is doing his dramatic homeward bound run over to Carl, he knocks Mrs. Dave over. But once the dust of all this craziness has finally settled, Lois and David affirm to each other once more that they do want to get married, and so the wedding resumes. Suddenly, we begin to pan out, fast forwarding into the future. We see a bookstore with a sign out front that says Book Reading by Ginger Foutley, and as we enter, we can see the back of an adult Ginger's head, reading her book aloud to an audience of her friends, family, and I assume fans as well. The first two characters that we see are Carl and Hoodsey, which, goddamn, Hoodsey, why are you looking at me like that? And in between them, standing in the back, we can see a much older Lois and David, happily listening to Ginger finish her story. Slowly panning to the right, we now see Macie, and way in the back behind her is an old man that I'm personally believing is Jonas. It hasn't been confirmed as far as I can tell, but look at this guy, that's old Jonas. Then sitting next to Macie is Dodie, who I'm sad to see that Ginger has stayed in contact with. And it would appear that Chet Zipper made the unfortunate mistake of procreating with her. Look at this man, he's regretted every life decision that led him to this moment. And of course we end with Darren, holding a little baby girl that just so happens to have— wait a second. What the f***? They got back together after all that. What the hell happened to Orion? And what happened to Simone? Did any of that actually matter? You can't just do this and walk away, Capnick! Except she did.
And if time teaches us anything in this crazy world, it's that nothing worth having ever comes easy. Thank you.
I am thankful for everyone that was involved with the production of As Told by Ginger, and I'm thankful that we were given at least some type of conclusion as opposed to nothing at all. Given how we've watched these characters evolve over time, it would have felt borderline criminal to not provide any sort of closure, but even so, it is very hard for me to say that what we ended up getting was satisfying. It's honestly pretty difficult for me to be happy that Darren and Ginger ended up together as adults, and a lot of that has to do with how we had the entire second half of the last season to demonstrate to us just how bad of a match they are. And I know that this is likely just meant to show that reconciliation is attainable, and also that people are capable of change as they get older. But we didn't get to see any of that. It kind of gives me flashbacks to the ending of How I Met Your Mother, in the sense that this was the end goal from day one, and they just chose to roll with it. But whereas Told by Ginger differs from How I Met Your Mother, this show lacked the necessary character development for this ending to make sense, which was the complete opposite problem for How I Met Your Mother. But these endings are similar in that each invokes feelings of betrayal on behalf of the characters in their journeys. I don't even think that Ginger needed to end up with Orion in the end. I liked him more as a love interest for Ginger, but clearly she wasn't as into him as he was into her. But for her to go back to Darren with zero context as to why, it feels like a critical missing piece from this puzzle. A piece that probably could have been found if this show was just given at least one more season. Allow me to propose an alternate ending that, to me, would have felt much more impactful given everything that As Told by Ginger aimed to accomplish. But allow me to preface this by saying that you are more than allowed to disagree with me. Proposing this ending is by no means me saying that I know better, because I am aware that writing a TV show is incredibly hard. All of the respect in the world to Emily Capnick and the crew who brought this show to life. So, my ending would still feature Darren attending her book reading, but in a much different context. After the events of season 3, it's only natural that they would reconcile and return to being friends. They simply have too much history together to just throw that friendship away. But if you really wanted to show that these characters have matured over the years, I think it would have been more powerful to have Ginger married to somebody else. Somebody that we've never actually met in the show, but it's obvious that Ginger has created a happy life with them. Perhaps after her book reading, she takes some time to catch up with her friends. And right after she shares a meaningful moment with Darren, giving us solid proof that these two have reconciled. A character that we've never met before comes up to Ginger and says, "Wow, great job, honey. I'm so proud of you. And Darren, how have you been?" And then they just have like a normal conversation. For some reason, it's easier for me to accept this kind of ending as opposed to the actual one, as any context that would have made this true ending feel proper were likely lost in the following seasons that never got to come to fruition. Despite me obviously taking issue with this outcome, I have to admit that I wouldn't even be thinking about all of this if if I didn't genuinely care about and enjoy these characters, which is something that I absolutely could not say by the time that I finished my rewatch of All Grown Up. From the very beginning, As Told by Ginger made it apparent to us that this was going to be not just a show, but a story, and everyone that we're introduced to has some kind of role to play in it. As much as I hate Dodie, I can't say that she didn't serve any kind of purpose by acting the way that she did. But then you take a look at Chucky's behavior, which only succeeded in bastardizing what was and still is a beloved character. As Told by Ginger and All Grown Up share so many similarities, and while there are definitely differences as well, As Told by Ginger possesses something that All Grown Up is completely devoid of, and that thing is respect. Respect for its characters, respect for its audience, and respect for the experience of growing up no matter who you are. And this resonates all the more when you take into consideration that As Told by Ginger ended the way that it did because it wasn't given that respect in return. All Grown Up is less focused on truth when it comes to the very subject matter that it covers. It does a decent job of glamorizing growing up and exciting younger viewers for what's to come, but then later on you realize that so much of it was lazy misrepresentation. One of the many truths about life is that growing up kinda sucks. It's not all bad, of course, and I do think that Ginger demonstrates the good and the bad pretty accurately, while All Grown Up chooses to either underplay or over-embellish the bad in order to keep its audience from actually thinking for a moment. After I released my All Grown Up video, I got a good amount of comments from people saying that they still like the show, and honestly, that's fine. I don't want to be the guy that tells you that you aren't allowed to like something because, well, that would be stupid. But my overall point here is that not only are these two shows incredibly similar, not just in concept, but other elements like how each has an artistic protagonist. That artistic protagonist has a weird younger sibling. There's an egotistical and rich blonde girl. Cree Summer. The similarities alone make it impossible to not compare. Yet when it comes down to which show was superior, it's completely indisputable that As Told by Ginger has All Grown Up beaten by a significantly wide margin. That's not to say that Ginger is perfect, I do have my gripes, but even then it managed to keep me invested all the way through. I wanted to see Ginger reach her artistic potential. I wanted to see Darren learn to be less self-critical and treat himself with more kindness. And I wanted Dodie to become a better person. And all of these feelings and opinions that I have are the direct result of the creativity and passion that brought As Told by Ginger to life, which unfortunately isn't something that I can say about All Grown Up, as that show seems to not only resent the forces behind its creation as well as its audience, but even its characters just reek of spite, and that's just not the kind of place where coming-of-age stories should manifest from. All Grown Up doesn't even qualify as a coming-of-age story, despite the show itself attempting to constantly convince you otherwise. I guess now that we're approaching the end here, it's time that I open up a bit about my own life and why I made these videos, even though their sheer runtimes combined should already be indication enough that this was about more than just All Grown Up and As Told by Ginger. My childhood wasn't awful by any means, however, a certain set of circumstances forced me to mature faster than most kids. You're not my therapist, so I don't have to explain everything to you, but that's the gist. And because of this, I always felt just a little bit disconnected to a lot of my peers, and this disconnection became all the more brutal when I started going through puberty. Thankfully, I had not just my family, but my friends as well, who I could rely on for almost anything. And many of those bonds that I forged back then amazingly still carry to this day. But I had my doubts about a lot of things. And perhaps my greatest doubt had to do with myself, manifesting into a long-term struggle with depression and imposter syndrome. From as far back as I can remember, Rugrats was one of my go-to comfort shows. And naturally, once All Grown Up made its way onto Nick, it too became a comfort show for me. And despite everything that I've said about it up until this point, I attribute Tommy's desire to be a filmmaker as a major influence in kickstarting my own interest in pursuing a creative career. And it's because of that I have always felt a strong connection to All Grown Up and to Tommy as a character. Flashing forward to my eventual rewatch of the series and making the realizations that I've already gone over, I was obviously disappointed. And while my opinions and my talking points are definitely dramatized for the sake of entertainment value here, the truth remains the same, in that it sucks when something that you love has aged like milk. which is why when I finally gave As Told by Ginger the chance that it deserved, I was caught off guard. It wasn't like my sense of nostalgia was resuscitated or saved, but rather it made me look back on my adolescence with a fresh perspective. Now, was it a healthy perspective? That's debatable. I did fall into a pitfall one night of looking up old classmates on Instagram and seeing how their lives are panning out in comparison to my own. Totally healthy stuff. But aside from that, my perspective changed more on how I viewed myself back then. Much like how Ginger struggled to find her way, I could see the parallels in my own life. From crushes to heartbreaks to heated arguments with friends and family, to the overwhelming desire to just feel accepted by even myself. None of these feelings came up when I watched All Grown Up, but to say that Ginger simply reminded me of all this is an understatement, because this is just what the show is. The adolescent experience in as raw of a form as you can get away with while maintaining that TV PG rating. And while it's easy to watch the conclusion and feel confused or frustrated about how things panned out, I'm starting to think that maybe there's something powerful to be said about that lack of context, almost as if Ginger herself is telling us that everything we just watched didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. These life experiences may feel impossible to conquer at the moment, and they may strike us down to our lowest points. But once the storm is past, you can eventually come to realize that these experiences don't define who you are at your core, and this can be said for whatever age you're at. There will always be struggles that you face, and they will always vary in complexity, leaving you to ask yourself practically the same questions from way back when, whether you realize it or not. In reality, we're all still just a bunch of kids trying to find our way in the world. And there is power in admitting that you still have a lot of learning to do. After all, we never really stop growing up, do we? I don't think that just saying thank you can properly capture how grateful I am that you have made it to the end of this video. 2.5 hours is a long time to listen to me talk, I'm aware. And I hope that it was time well spent for you. Not only was making this video a journey for me, but the amount of kindness, patience, and support that everyone gave me over the past year has meant everything to me. There was a lot of chaos in 2023 that prevented me from getting this done sooner, so thank you all for understanding. In addition to the obligatory like, comment, and subscribe spiel that always comes at the end of these things, I think this may also be a better time than any to announce that I am officially launching a Patreon. Making these videos is truly what brings me the most fulfillment in life, and I would like to invest more of my time into creating more content for you all to enjoy. And I would like to do so at a much more frequent pace. Supporting me on Patreon will do just that, as it will literally afford me more time to develop more videos for you. There are multiple tiers available starting as low as $2 a month, and that $2 will give you access to all the exclusive content that I produce over there. You'll also get sneak peeks and early access to new videos. So I don't know, sounds like a pretty sweet deal if you ask me. Anyway, thank you once again, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.